Before we broke for lunch, Mr. Dumont, there was some discussion that you were going to have with Ms. Porter about admission of exhibits. Have you folks resolved that?
I have very reasonable clients, and they advise me to just drop the issue and move on. It's not worth fighting over.
Okay.
We very graciously accept.
Oh, maybe I continue.
Yeah, thanks.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hopkins.
Good afternoon.
Now I want to ask you briefly about an area in which you clearly have expertise, and that is the efficiency of cold climate heat pumps. It's something a physicist would know a great deal about, I believe.
I have been learning more as the technology advances into the market here in Vermont, and I feel I have a solid basis for stating analysis and opinions based on such.
And do you agree with me that, based on what you now know, that cold climate heat pumps are competitive, cost competitive with natural gas per BTU?
On a pure operational basis, to deliver heat into the space in which heat pumps deliver the heat, heat pumps are, or can be, depending on how they are operated by the homeowner, can be cost competitive, at least in some outdoor weather conditions, etc. It's the dynamics of actually operating a heat pump for optimal economic performance are complicated.
Top of page 4, you conclude natural gas remains less expensive on a per BTU basis than typical air source cold climate heat pumps. So what you're saying now is a little bit different from that, is it not? So would it be more accurate to say, depending on the circumstances, natural gas is cost competitive on a per BTU basis with typical air source cold climate heat pumps?
I might change some of the words in the middle of that to can be or may be rather than is. It depends a lot on the system and how it's configured and operated, et cetera, like I just described. Again, that's on an operational per BTU basis, not on a lifetime basis accounting for the cost of hardware, et cetera.
Would you agree with me that in preparing the exhibits you prepared in your pre-filed testimony on for May 6th, you did not take into account distribution losses that arise from gas furnaces but do not arise from cold climate ductless heat pumps?
Correct.
As you sit here today as an expert in this area, do you have any opinion as to the amount of the distribution losses?
It's my understanding that distribution losses are in typical forced air or water systems are on the scale of a few percent, but that it can vary, again, based on a particular building's characteristics.
I assume you read Mr. Meany's pre-filed rebuttal testimony dated May 27th.
Correct.
He addressed distribution losses. Do you disagree with his testimony?
No.
Going back to page 3 of your May 6th pre-filed, lines 10 and 11 state there is approximately a 25% advantage when comparing natural gas to oil, correct?
That's not correct. That calculation was based on a weighted average of oil and propane.
Okay.
And includes, as it says in that sentence, rate impact as if the company were going to recover the full costs immediately as per its current capital structure, et cetera.
So I wonder if you would agree with me that it's a fair summary of the issue, one issue before the board at this point, given what we now know about project cost and fuel prices, whether this case should be reopened to consider whether or not the statutory criteria would still be satisfied by spending $154 million in order to address a 25% price advantage for approximately 3,000 customers. Would you agree that's an issue before the board right now?
It's my understanding that the question about whether to reopen the proceeding is before the board, and whether there is evidence, given the cost change and given other changes, like the changes in oil prices, et cetera, are so material and controlling as to likely change the outcome of the previous consideration of the CPG.
And you put that in your pre-file a couple times, what you thought the legal standard was. So I did want to ask you about that, and then I think I'm done. Have you read the motions that were filed under Rule 60B by the various parties that filed the motions?
No.
So let me represent to you that the motions fall in two areas. One is, would the board more likely than not have reached a different outcome? And within that area, there are two separate questions. Would the board is the board likely to have reached a different outcome on October 10th? And is the board likely to have reached a different outcome on December 23rd? Both issues are in front of the board under the motions that are pending. Did you intend to address both? Is your testimony just addressing December 23rd, or is it also addressing October 10th?
As I believe I stated here, at some point, it's my intention to address any change in circumstance that's happened between the original issuance of the CPG, which I remember the date, if I remember the dates correctly, is the December date you referred to, and to analyze what we can know about the various impacted criteria given current information.
Well, let me quote you from the October 10th order. It says, we find there is a reasonable basis to conclude that the revised cost projections are reliable. First, many of the cost elements in the revised budget are no longer projections, but reflect actual costs. For instance, VGS has put the project out to bid and entered into contracts. VGS has now purchased pipe for the project. Furthermore, the revised projections include a contingency. Though VGS has indicated that the updated cost projections in July were prepared by the previous firm, CHA, whose performance in managing cost projections proved unsatisfactory to the company over time, VGS's president testified under oath at the September 26th hearing that the project is now under new management that is capable and is producing reasonable cost projections. If the board, is it your testimony that if the board knew then what it knows now, it would have reached the same conclusions?
I'm going to object on relevance. What is the relevance of this witness's opinion of what the board knew in another proceeding?
Well, this witness's pre-filed testimony addresses the legal standard. And if you want to withdraw that part of his testimony, I'll stipulate to that. But otherwise, I'm cross-examining him on the subject matter of his testimony.
Well, I think he was talking about the legal standard in this proceeding, not that proceeding.
This proceeding is both to decide whether or not to hold hearings to reopen the October 10th ruling and to whether or not to hold hearings to reopen the December 23rd hearing.
Well, I mean, I think I also object to you characterizing what we are about as opposed to allowing the board to tell us what we're about in the scope and then asking the witness to comment on your characterization.
Well, so your objections, I've responded to it. The board can rule.
Yeah, we're going to overrule the objection. Continue asking the question.
Thank you.
Could you either restate the question or have it read back, since I got lost in there?
Me too. Could you read it back?
Let me quote you from the October 10th order. It says, we find there is a reasonable basis to conclude that the revised cost projections are reliable. First, many of the cost elements in the revised budget are no longer projections but reflect actual costs. For instance, VGS has put the project out to bid and entered into contracts. VGS has not purchased pipe for the project. Thus, the revised projections include a contingency. Though VGS has indicated the updated cost projections in July were prepared by the previous firm, CHA, whose performance in managing cost projections proved unsatisfactory to the company over time. VGS's president testified under oath at the September 26th hearing that the project is now under new management that is capable and is and is producing reasonable cost projections. Is it your testimony that if the board knew then what it knows now, it would have reached the same conclusions?
Thank you.
Okay, I'm trying to parse the question carefully. I don't think that my testimony addresses that question.
As the sole witness for the department, do you have an opinion on that, or does the department have an opinion on that?
I don't know that the department has an opinion. I might let briefing or something handle that. I'm not aware personally aware of a departmental position on that question.
Okay, thank you. Similar question about the December 23rd, 2013 order. Would you agree with me that there have been some major changes since then? Oil prices dropped to about half of what it was then, correct?
I don't know if it's exactly half, but they've dropped significantly.
The project price has gone from 86 million to 154 million.
The estimated price, yes.
However we choose to characterize it, there's now CNG already available to the industrial customers and commercial customers in Middlebury and Virgins, correct?
There are customers taking CNG service.
So is it your position that the board should not even hold a hearing to decide whether or not to reopen the December 23rd order under Rule 60B?
It is my opinion that the criteria impacted by those changes, although I disagree, I think, with the characterization on would disagree on the CNG piece, but particularly the first two. That with respect to the criteria that are impacted most directly by those changes, that given the best analysis we have in front of us, the board's conclusions on those points would not most likely change, and therefore that there is not call for a reopen proceeding.
Thank you.
Mr. Gray, do you have questions for this witness?
Dr. Hopkins, do you have an opinion on whether parties were denied a full and fair opportunity to litigate the issues before this board due to the incorrect information provided by VGS relative to the cost of the project?
No, I don't have an opinion on that.
Nothing further.
Mr. Solomon, do you have questions for this witness?
I have a few, thank you. I take it you relied entirely on Vermont Gas for matters related to conversion costs, is that right?
In my direct testimony, I relied on Vermont Gas's numbers. In my rebuttal testimony, I did a set of sensitivity analyses to illuminate whether the results of my analysis would differ in any substantial way if conversion costs were in fact different from those projected by VGS.
And you concluded that converting from oil to gas makes financial sense if the conversion costs are up $8,000. Is that what you concluded?
The two different analyses that I conducted in my rebuttal both indicated a result in that range.
And you assume a number of 100 MMBTU of heating fuel per home, right?
Right.
And do you know how many gallons of oil that would be if you converted it at typical conversion rates and so on like
I usually just work in BTU units, but based on comments from the similarities earlier, it sounded like the number was something 724 or thereabouts.
Isn't it more like close to 900, 896? No? Okay. You're the one who went to Caltech. All right. I'm in over my head on this one. With regard to, I take it though that in your initial calculations at least, you didn't try to put numbers on things like removing oil tanks. We've already talked about this with similarities, but removing oil tanks and piping and all that, changing the burners and so on.
Right. My direct testimony did not attempt to account for any of those costs in particular, just took the aggregate number from VGS. The sensitivity analysis is intended to allow some insights as to how those other costs, should they exist, might impact customer economics.
Did you consider in your analysis that one reason for investing in an electric heat pump might be also air conditioning, the availability of air conditioning?
I did not directly address that, no.
Do you know how many homes in Addison County have already added electric heat pumps?
I don't know.
Let me ask you something. Since you're much better at math than I am, obviously. Ms. Similarity said that she had an average, I believe, of something like 784, I believe it was, as the average gallonage and used by an average oil user. And I believe that Mr. Cota had a considerably lower number. Taking her number, was it 784 or 724? One is 724, take her number. And oil is now running somewhat less than $3 a gallon, right?
That's my
270 on the
I would check the most recent fuel price report for that.
270. Now, I was going to have you multiply by 3, but let's have you multiply by 270. If you multiply that out, no calculators, please. If you multiply that out, where do you come out? About
one of the bits of advice that I got from veteran witnesses of the department was never to try to do math on the stand. I can flip one of these pieces of paper over and do the multiplication.
This is part of your learning as an economist.
Or pull out a calculator, but if you need to know an exact number.
It's about 1900 or something, right?
You say 1500.
I'd have to actually do the math.
Call it a couple of thousand.
It's probably in the ballpark of a couple of thousand.
Now, if Vermont Gas is going around telling people that each customer will save a couple $1,000 a year, and if oil is running for an average customer less than a couple of thousand a year, is it not the case that they'd have to give it away in order to effect a break even?
I guess I don't. I I'm not sure about that break-even characterization. I was able to find where, in one of my exhibits, that I actually already done that calculation for you. It's 2,089 using that winter average oil price for this
So
last
they'd have
winter.
to sell it for they'd have to sell a winter supply for $89 in order to break even. In order to gain an advantage, they'd have to.
In order for a customer to save $2,000 in operating cost at current oil prices, then yes, that's true. That's not a statement about overall break-even of hardware changes and any of the rest of that, just on a pure operating cost basis.
Yeah.
In order not to break even, but in order to save $2,000 a year.
Okay. But, so that one of the tools in Mr. Brendel's toolbox is to give it away, right? And then you get a break even.
Well, again, I don't think that break even is saving $2,000. I think saving $2,000 is saving $2,000. But I think that the analysis that I conducted, the sort of simple payback type analysis, is the most relevant and illustrative for that point. VGS is a company that is both a rate-regulated company and operates in a competitive marketplace, and that surely shapes how they think about rates.
Thank you. Another question? Okay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Hopkins.
Good afternoon.
Good afternoon, Mr. Mayor.
One point of contention between your testimony and Mr. Dismukes' analysis, and also some of the Palmer witnesses, was concerning the value that the board should ascribe to a ton of avoided CO2 emissions, whether it should be $100 or $40. And it's been cited to the board that the board has used $100 a ton in other proceedings, like energy efficiency proceedings. And so my question to you as the state planner is it necessary for the board to apply a consistent measure of the value of a ton of CO2 across different types of regulatory proceedings?
I do think that would have real value. I think just as in the energy efficiency context, we compare energy efficiency acquisition with the cost of supply and think of energy efficiency as a supply resource, and try to have parallelism on that front, that the same should apply, that a ton of CO2 in the atmosphere avoided doesn't particularly care whether it was avoided by energy efficiency or avoided by a fuel choice that somebody made.
And so just to elaborate on that a little bit more, if the board was to adopt the value of $40 a ton as the value of as the appropriate value, how would that impact the way the state chooses energy efficiency projects?
If the board chose to use a value of $40 a ton in efficiency proceedings, the particular effect would be that in the cost-effectiveness screening tool process and overall measure and program and portfolio level screening for whether something is cost-effective or not from a societal standpoint, that the emission reductions resulting from efficiency would be valued somewhat less, which could result in individual projects or programs that the efficiency provider runs not screening and therefore not being offered to their customers. The practical direct impact of changing that.
Good afternoon, Dr. Hopkins. I'm going to ask you to try to help me with something that I will honestly say I'm having trouble trying to decipher, because I have a whole bunch of different witnesses here presenting different approaches, different models that at some point we have to ultimately try to reconcile in some way. And so I'm hoping that that you, and I'll be asking Dr. Dismukes and others the same types of questions, can help a little bit on this. Let me just start off with your disagreement with Dr. Dismukes that you expressed in your rebuttal testimony. And you and Mr. Dumont were talking about this earlier today, and that's the use of GDP as opposed to economic output. Do you recall that discussion?
Yeah.
And in the end, and please correct me if I'm wrong here, but my understanding of your testimony after your discussion with Mr. Dumont was, it's just a different approach, it's not wrong per se. Now, your written testimony seemed to say that because it basically double counts certain components of the cost, it's not as accurate. Can you summarize how I should take what you wrote versus what you said today?
So just because something is not as accurate doesn't mean that it doesn't have value. So I think that's the prime distinction that I would make there, that a calculation of economic output has some value, and a calculation of GDP is a somewhat better reflection of the B4 criterion itself, and is therefore a somewhat better metric to use for decision making on that criterion. If one only had output numbers and not GDP numbers, you would have something and you could work with that. But if you have GDP numbers as well, then I would give somewhat greater weight to the GDP type analysis.
Well, let me just ask, in terms of comparing the two analyses, let's assume you put similar inputs in. I mean, I understand there are some disagreements on inputs, and we'll get to that. But let's assume that when some of the bigger items, the discount rate and the job loss issue that Dr. Dismukes raised, you had entered the same numbers in both the GDP model and the output number. Would you expect to basically spit out essentially the same result, maybe an order of magnitude, maybe some difference in quantity? I mean, I'll answer that one first.
So the challenge comes because different portions of the sort of economic cost benefit macroeconomic piece, whether it be done in IMPLAN or REMI or REDIME, different portions of that analysis are more or less sort of in state than other portions. And so when some portions are positive and others are negative, if the ones that are negative tend to be more out of state, and therefore the correlation is that if they're a little bit more sort of import related, they will tend to have more output impact and less GDP impact. And if it's more about in-state spending, it will tend to be a little bit more on par between GDP and output. And so when things that are on one side of the ledger have sort of a different ratio between output and GDP than things that are on the other side of the ledger, then switching between the two, it may not change the sign of the answer, but it could. And since what we're after here is fundamentally is the sign of an answer, it's worth being careful on that point.
Should we be concerned about VGS's analysis because they're not measuring GDP per se, or is that simply a different approach?
I think that all of the analyses that various parties have presented all have some value, and it's up to you to decide the weighting to give to those different pieces. But I would, for example, I mean, I identified some concerns I had with Ms. Similarity's testimony in terms of adding up different kinds of value on that plus or minus scale, and that it was a little bit of apples and oranges adding. That doesn't mean that each individual component of that doesn't have value, but I would not give as much value to their sum as I might to a more sort of coherent one-piece type analysis where you're really adding apples to apples to apples.
me get into the question of job losses, which is one of the disagreements. Is that one of the larger reasons that your results are different from Dr. Dismukes?
Particularly the question of job losses in the fuel provider industry? Right, okay. Yes, that's definitely one of the major areas of difference between Dr. Dismukes' analysis and my analysis. You want to ask particular questions about that piece, or?
I'm going to hit a few particular questions. So let's start off with your rebuttal testimony basically makes the point that his analysis, correct me if I'm wrong, his analysis assumes that job losses would not be replaced. Was that your observation?
His analysis assumes some continuing job loss through time, as does ours. And I think that it is actually appropriate to recognize that ongoing effect. The main difference, that, as I see it, between on the fuel provider impact side between Dr. Dismukes and his analysis and my analysis is in the question of overall scale and whether the results are meet with a common sense test in terms of the size of the impact and which of the inputs does the output scale with appropriately.
Okay, well, I'll ask you to explain exactly, I mean, I don't want to put words in your mouth, but what implicit in what you said seemed to be you think his numbers are too big for job losses. Is that a simplified way of saying what you just said?
That's one of the conclusions that I would draw, yes.
What's your basis for that?
So the first basis is a sort of common sense check. So I don't have his numbers in front of me, so I apologize if I get them a little bit wrong. But he actually very helpfully broke out the job loss pieces into direct, indirect, and induced. And direct jobs are jobs that are directly in the industry, not in the suppliers to that industry and not in the economy at large because of the wages that those people take home, but directly in the industry. So in 2034, if I remember the numbers right, because I was just looking through I think the number is 88 jobs lost in 2034 in the direct piece. So just to think through what that means that of those roughly 2,400, 2,500 customers that VGS expects to be serving at that point, that the loss of those 2,400 or 2,500 customers costs 88 people their jobs. And that to me, that implies something a little under 30 customers per employee of a fuel dealer firm. Given that folks generally have their tank filled, a few times a winter, the idea that a single employee at a fuel dealing company might essentially serve one customer a day, roughly. I mean, these are all just sort of rough back of the envelope kind of calculations. But the idea that there's a one customer per day means one employee doesn't match with my common sense understanding of how that industry works, that filling that one tank is unlikely to make enough money for the firm to pay that person's wages for the day and the costs of those gallons of fuel, et cetera. So thus those numbers seem just weirdly high. Our analysis reached similar conclusions. The numbers were a little bit different when we just trusted Remy and put numbers in. And we looked at that and said, that seems odd. The other aspect of Dr. Dismukes is the fact that the numbers just keep rising and rising and rising throughout the period, driven, I think, based on our experience looking at Remy, by the fact that there is basically inflation in the oil price, maybe is different from the rate of inflation that's otherwise fundamentally in the economic model, resulting in the anything that sort of scales with pure dollar sales, getting out of whack and sort of rising up in a way that really the difference between serving 2,300 customers, losing 2,300 customers in 1 year and losing 2,330 customers in the next shouldn't be so great as to result in that much additional job loss year after year. So it's those kind of sort of credibility checks against the numbers that give me pause, and that I think that our revised analysis working either looking at on a margin basis, looking at the trucking model, or even breaking it down even further in terms of a simple model of what the economics of a fuel dealing firm might look like, gives what I think are much more credible numbers in terms of scale. They don't go out of whack in odd ways, and I think they are therefore more credible analysis for the board to rely upon.
Did you interpret Dr. Dismukes' direct job losses as being incremental job losses each year or cumulative job losses?
Cumulative in the sense that relative to some baseline case, that there would be, say, 88 fewer jobs in that sector in 2034 than there would have been otherwise. Okay. The direct employment, if the fuel sector in Vermont might employ, I'm just going to make up a number because I don't actually know, 2,000 people, that Dr. Dismukes' analysis would imply that if the pipeline were built, that would be 2,000 minus 88, that it would be, whatever, 1,912 in that year.
That would be the direct net employment effect in that particular year, and that would also ripple through the economy as a result.
And the rippling through the economy is captured in the indirect and induced numbers that are associated with that.
Okay. And you agree with Dr. Dismukes that this is a factor that should be considered, but you think the way you've captured it is better?
Correct.
Okay. Let me move to another topic. Actually, just had a curiosity question. I don't know if you can help me with it. Do you know what the employment numbers are in Addison County for people working, basically fuel dealers, and the people whose jobs would be displaced?
I don't know. It's possible that Mr. Cota might.
And it's possible that Mr. Cota will be asked that question. Okay, let me go back to your, I'm going to start with your direct testimony, please, on page 5. You state that the revised cost estimate for the project would be expected to change the quantifiable sources of value more so than the quantified sources. Can you explain why you reached that conclusion?
The non-quantified sources of value, such as the ones identified there about the value of firm supply or of wins of fuel price volatility, or later list others like the opportunity for further expansion. Those are sort of standalone pieces of value that are like, it doesn't, if I'm a customer, having firm supply versus not having firm supply, that difference alone to me is not particularly impacted by what the pipeline costs. Same with those other kinds of characteristics.
Okay. And as a result, the magnitude is not likely to change as much simply due to the change in cost.
Correct.
Page 8 of your testimony, you state that you have not included property tax payments in your model. Do you recall that? Line 8.
The property tax payments are not included in the sort of spreadsheet direct cost of benefits pieces. We did include them, and that's the context for this piece. They are included explicitly in the REMI macroeconomic model.
Okay. So you do think they should be included, you just haven't included them in this particular comparison you do?
In the analysis that I'm presenting in question answer 13, that is a more like direct ratepayer cost kind of calculation with some other factors included as well, but because it's intended to sort of track the direct dollars flowing back and forth amongst Vermonters, and just calculate up only that aspect, not the subsequent rippling through the economy, et cetera. And so in that particular context, property taxes that I pay, if the project pays more property taxes, somebody else may pay less, but the average across the state is zero. So that's a transfer within Vermont, and thus not captured in this particular portion.
When we are looking at the VGS's analysis, the similarities that presented, it included property taxes as an item. For the same reason, should we be excluding that, or is that a different approach and it's appropriate to include property taxes?
I forget exactly how the similarities includes it. If, for example, property taxes were not included in some of the other costs and benefits in her calculation, it might make sense to include them in order to cancel out their having not been in one of the other lines. And I don't know exactly how that, they might need to be in the list in order to cancel appropriately. But I'm not sure exactly how they're included or not. Again, generally concerned that sort of stack of values and costs and benefits that Ms. Samari's provided they're not all the same kind of a thing, and so I'm not sure about exactly how they fit together.
On pages 9 and 10, you identified the potential effect on the value of the project from adjusting the ROE and the capital structure. Do you see that?
Yeah.
After looking at this, are there things that should be done along the lines you're recommending that would help ensure value to customers from the project? Or at this time, or is this more just hypothetical?
I think this is hypothetical. It's indicative of the kind of impact that subsequent rate cases might be able to have on the overall net benefit of the project, recognizing that that's not the purpose of this proceeding, as I understand it. But just indicative generally that capital structure, rate of return can have material impact on the net economic benefit that the project might provide.
And at this time, you're not prepared with specific recommendations, I take it? Okay.
Correct, yeah.
Next page, page 11. You state that certain benefits are not included in your calculation. Have you attempted at all to value these?
You're looking at answer 17, is that right?
Yes.
So some of the things in that list, like, this answer is a transition between the spreadsheet model before and the REMI model after. And so some of the things that I identified there, like the economic multipliers, energy cost savings, and the economic benefit from construction, are then captured in the analysis to follow. The non-quantifiable benefits are not captured in any other way subsequently. I have not made an attempt to quantify the benefits of VGS's expanded efficiency programs, recognizing that that's to be the exact sort of shape and scope of that is subject to the 76-76 process underway now.
Okay, but basically the REMI model does capture a lot of these secondary these other effects because of the nature of it as a model.
Correct. It's capable of doing more than a spreadsheet can.
Page 13. You state you have not based your analysis on the present state in which some industrial customers take CNG service. Is that correct?
Correct.
Should we be looking at this project from the perspective of, since some customers now are taking that service, isn't the real change when you're looking at it from CNG to natural gas as opposed to from fuel oil to natural gas?
As I state here, I don't think that in the context of this remand type proceeding, that the changing the baseline in that way is appropriate. As we did as the department's witnesses did in the original proceeding, it would be possible to look at alternate cases. At this point, with a project sort of partly built, there's no way to define a good sort of alternate case of the state of the world on the ground as it would be if some random string of things, or maybe a carefully designed string of things, happened or didn't happen. That's an odd place to try to set a new baseline while you're in the middle of an action. So from a sort of pure analytical standpoint, I think changing the baseline would be difficult. It is possible to get a rough sense of what this REMI simulation, for example, might have produced for the hypothetical, which doesn't exist, of the project having never been proposed and some number of customers having switched over to CNG. But we can't get to that world from here. So it's possible to do that analysis, and one might learn something from it, but it's not as immediately directly relevant, I think, to the question here.
I guess I'm curious as to why this component shouldn't be adjusted. I mean, we're sitting here adjusting fuel prices, oil prices. We're sitting here adjusting the freight costs, the availability of cold climate heat pumps, and a number of other factors. Why not this one? That's what I'm missing.
So I think there is a distinction between changing sort of assumptions and inputs on the sense of prices and costs of things versus changing the entire frame of reference for the analysis. I think it's more appropriate at this point to be considering the changes in prices and costs, but not to change the entire frame of analysis in the way of a complete change in baseline that would accompany this adoption of the CNG baseline instead.
We still haven't said why.
Yeah, I guess.
I mean, if you're a business and you're trying to make a decision, I'm sort of analogizing the situation to some costs. If you're a business and you're trying to make a decision, once you've done something, it's done, and you look forward. And that's sort of like what I feel like is the situation we're in now.
Right. I understand that. I think my understanding of sort of the sort of scope and framing for this proceeding is in the question of this particular kind of remand context, which I think maybe is slightly different from the frame that you were talking. In that other frame, it would be possible to essentially analyze that other case of pretend there had never been a pipeline and the customer switched to CNG, and what would the net economic impact of that be? And you could then, I think I could still say I disagree with using that as a baseline, but one could at least compare that as a different scenario to the pipeline scenario. That's what Mr. Nagel and Mr. Poor did in the direct case, where they compared the project case to an industrial LNG case and an industrial CNG case. If you want to look at table 3, I could sort of show you how that would what that would look like, and I believe it would show that the net economic benefit to the state of the project built at its current cost, current fuel prices, et cetera, remains as it was in the direct case, greater than the economic benefit of simply industrial customers adopting CNG and stopping there.
theirs, and have you read Mr. Gross's testimony, please?
I have read it, yes.
Do you have any reaction to the feasibility of his CNG island approach, and as to whether that might be a least cost solution compared to the pipeline?
I think I can sort of see where that analysis comes from. I was confused by parts of it about how the business model would work and who was paying for what. But I think that alternate scenario is something potentially to consider, in the context of, you're recognizing the context of the proceeding that we're in and where we are in the real world. But recognize also that scenario foregoes various other benefits that, if you were really looking from a societal least cost type perspective, you might really want to figure out how whether that was worthwhile from an overall least cost standpoint.
I take it you have not attempted to quantify whether that type of solution would in fact be least cost?
I have not. I think defining exactly what least cost means in that case is a challenge, and if I'm more prepared to think about what say the V4 criteria net economic benefit type picture would look like under a CNG delivery only scenario, rather than sort of consideration of what might be if someone proposed some other thing. That would require some whole other set of analysis. The general construct we seem to operate in generally is we can generally have least cost planning, but we also have firms making business decisions and proposing to do particular things, and we have to recognize that it's those things that we're weighing in on in proceedings like this one.
On page 15 of your direct testimony, you discussed the rate impacts on existing customers. Is the department's view that the cross-subsidy can be adequately addressed through rate recovery, and that therefore it should not be a concern to the board?
I don't think that not being concerned is the right framing for that. And I think the not being so dispositive a concern as to say you should say that the project is no longer in the general good of the state, yes, but you should definitely be aware of and consider any cross-subsidy as I described it here.
Okay, let me rephrase the question then. The existence of the cross-subsidy, or the size of the cross-subsidy and the existence of the cross-subsidy, in your mind, does not mean this project does not promote the general good of the state?
Correct. Not to say that we couldn't make it better through rates, but that's a different proceeding.
Thank you.
I'm a little bit concerned about getting Mr. Meany on and off by 3:30. Do you want to interrupt
Thank you.
Mr. Hopkins, Dr. Hopkins' testimony so we can bring Mr. Meany?
Thank you.
Yes, why don't we do that? And if you would hang around, Dr. Hopkins, we can bring you back. I'll be here. And hope to get you done by 5 as well. Appreciate it. I understand the testimony and exhibits have been stipulated to be entered into evidence, and so they're admitted. And I think cross-examination starts with Jack.
Thank you. Hello, Mr. Meany.
Hello.
I have only a couple of questions. I believe you have in front of you what's been marked as Exhibit Petitioner Cross Lions 1, a November 13, 2014 study.
I do not have it in front of me, but I'm familiar with the document.
Okay, I provided that your counsel.
Sorry, I thought you had it.
That's okay, is it all right if I hand the
Yes,
witness a copy?
please. We don't object to admitting it.
And here's my question. Page 4 of your testimony, you refer to I'm going to say the acronym, NEEP, Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership, is that right?
You're referring to my testimony or my report?
I'm sorry, page 4 of your report?
Of the May 6th report, okay?
That's right, page 4. There is a reference to a Northeast Energy Efficiency Partnership meta-study in footnote 7. Do you see that? Or footnote 6?
I do.
Is this the study that you were?
Yes, it is.
Okay, so that's what you used for your coefficient of performance?
That's correct.
Thank you. The only other question I have is on page 7 of your report. You provide carbon emission rate assumptions for different fuels. Do you see that?
I do.
And for the electricity, which in this case I believe you're using for the cold climate heat pump option, what is the fuel type that forms the basis for the emissions rate?
Give me a second here to remind myself. There isn't necessarily any particular fuel type. It is as the report notes, in the paragraph right above table 5, it says for electricity I use the Vermont-specific marginal emissions rates at the generator that were estimated in the regional 2013 avoided cost study, and then increase them by the marginal winter line loss rates.
Am I accurate in understanding that the marginal emissions, or I'm sorry, the generators that were used for the Vermont-specific marginal emission rates included natural gas?
I'm sure that the analysis included consideration of natural gas, and I suspect that natural gas was on the margin at least some portion of the time, and still is some portion of the time in New England. It's probably not, well, I don't know whether that is the case in every single hour in the analysis that was used to generate those emission rates.
The emission rate is higher, prior to your adjustment for the COP, is higher than the tons per MMBTU for the other fuel types, correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I have no further questions.
Did you want to admit those exhibits?
Thank you. And if
I don't object if you want to.
okay, we move to admit Exhibit Petitioners Cross Lions 1 and Exhibit Petitioners Cross Lions 2, and I should say there also, the identification is 62215 Lions 1 and 62215 Lions 2, because in the first remand proceeding, there were several exhibits that were entered with a similar exhibit reference.
I understand Mr. Dumont doesn't object. Anybody else object? They're admitted. Mr. Gray, do you have a cross for this witness?
No, I do not.
No.
Good afternoon, Mr. Meany. How are you today?
I'm fine, thank you.
Good. A few questions. Elements of your report have been challenged by both the similarities and by Dr. Hopkins. Are you familiar with the criticism?
Can you be specific about which criticisms you're referring to?
Well, let's say Dr. Hopkins, he talks about the market demand relative to heat pumps and other things.
Yes, I'm not sure I would necessarily characterize, are you referring to what he said in his rebuttal testimony?
Yes.
Where he did the simple payback analysis?
Yes.
I don't read that as a criticism or a rebutting of my testimony. He's, in that, my understanding of what he says in that discussion, or what he's actually even trying to do, is to
take a particular viewpoint to inform whether residential customers would potentially be interested in fuel switching either to natural gas or fuel pump. I have several concerns with the way he approached it, but he didn't rebut my presumption that the COP, average COP would be 2.7. And in fact, in his Appendix C to his own testimony, that's the very assumption that he used in his modeling, for example. So I think he's addressing a different question than I addressed in my testimony.
I understand, thank you. When you testified in September 2014, in the first remand hearing, you speculated as to the likely availability of multi-head cold climate heat pumps in Vermont. It is now June, and we have since had another cold winter. To what extent, if at all, has the marketplace responded by making multi-head cold climate heat pumps available as you predicted?
As I predicted, they became available. I believe they were first available for sale in Vermont on the order of January, give or take a month. I just got a price quote myself for one in my own house, and I think have a contractor coming to install a 3-head system next week.
How does the 3-head system differ than what was available a year ago?
What was available a year ago were what we call single-head systems. That is, they had a single outdoor unit connected to a single indoor unit. The 3-head system I'll be having installed in my house has an outdoor compressor that's connected to 3 different air handlers in the house. So it enables, with one outdoor kind of compact system, to heat and or cool a larger portion of the building.
So rather than having a forced air ducted system to heat a larger home, you could use the multi-head system to heat the home?
You could.
There's been some testimony that the residents of Addison County have a greater reliance on wood and wood pellets for heating their homes than residents of Chittenden County. Are you familiar with that testimony?
I am not.
Have you done any analysis comparing, in your work you've compared a shift to cold climate heat pumps and oil, cold climate heat pumps and natural gas. Have you looked at another comparison to cold climate heat pumps and wood or wood pellets, given the number of usages there are?
You know, I have not done that analysis. I don't know that you would necessarily. Well, one could look at the economics of use of a cold climate heat pump compared to use of some form of fuel wood, if that's what you're using to heat your house. You could also conceivably look at marrying them together.
Well, that was what I was referring to. Was that you know, I think in some of your testimony you referred to having cold climate heat plant as a complement to gas or oil or propane. Have you done a study to assess cold climate heat pump as a complement to wood or wood pellets?
I have not.
In your report, you conclude that the board needs to focus on societal elements, societal economics rather than customer economics when analyzing the relative cost effectiveness of residential fuel switching from oil to gas versus switching to ductless heat pumps. That's correct, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
You further conclude that under societal economics, the cost effectiveness of residential fuel switching to natural gas is questionable because the societal cost includes the infrastructure investment.
That's correct.
Okay. Doesn't the customer pay for that investment as part of her monthly bill? Isn't that a personal cost as well?
Well, as I understand it, the mechanism through rates the precise mechanism through rates by which Vermont Gas would recover the full cost of the infrastructure is yet to be determined. But as I understand it, the presumption is that it's going to be recovered through rates that are paid by all Vermont Gas customers. So to the extent that the new customers are part of all Vermont Gas customers in the future, they would be bearing some portion of that cost. However, it would be a relatively small portion, you know, percentage-wise, because they're a relatively small portion of the total population of Vermont Gas customers. So the vast majority of the cost would be borne, as I understand it, by customers, at least initially, by customers other than those who are being converted to natural gas. I'll also observe that in the customer economics analysis that I did, as stated in the testimony, I did not account for the rate impacts that the spreading of the cost of the pipeline across all customers would have on gas prices. So that's not included in the customer
But that would be
economics.
included in societal economics analysis.
Well, yes, in theory, the portion of the cost that they are paying should have been included in the, should ideally be included in the customer economics as well. But in societal economics, one would want to include the entire cost of the project and compare it to the entire range of benefits. Or in this case, since I only looked at the residential sector, what I did was to take the entire cost of the project, come up with a proxy basis for reasonably assuming what portion of it would be borne by the residential sector, and then compared that portion of the project cost to the residential project benefits.
So following up on what Mr. Tasley was asking you, I think it's referring to page 4 of your testimony, and I'm looking at the sentence, lines 9 to 11, in which you say that from a societal perspective.
I'm sorry, are we on page 4 of my testimony, or
Yes.
page 4 of my
Testimony.
report, of my testimony?
From a societal perspective, you say, line 9, are you there?
Yes.
Which includes consideration of such gas infrastructure costs. I'm going to pause there because I believe that's what we were just discussing.
Correct.
And then you say, as well as impacts on the environment. The gas fuel switch is at best a break-even proposition and could increase societal costs. Which impacts were you alluding to, and did you quantify them? Which environmental impacts?
The environmental impacts that I'm referring to in particular there are carbon impacts, which were quantified through the use of the cost-effectiveness screening tool that I use.
So you did not account for methane impacts?
I did not.
Thank you.
Any follow-up questions to our questioning? Any redirect?
No.
Yes, we're done then with this witness?
I know he has a minor child to pick up at summer camp.
Summer camp and then off to a baseball game.
Thank you. You're excused.
Thank you.
Okay, I think we should return to Mr. Hopkins. I believe we concluded our questioning of Dr. Hopkins. Are there any follow-up questions based on our question?
Yes, I did have some.
Sure, go ahead.
Dr. Hopkins, you had questions, I think, from the chairman and from Mr. Young about approaching the existing investment in phase 1 as a sunk cost. Do you recall that?
Yes.
Are you aware that there are precedents to this board, such as the Seabrook precedent, that specifically address the situation we're in right now?
I'm not familiar with those precedents.
I just want to be clear about something. I was referring to the industrial customers who put in CNG,
Yes.
not to the cost that Vermont Gas has spent on this
I
project.
mischaracterized that, thank you.
Okay, I just want to be clear that
Yes. That's my
I
fault.
was now referring to Vermont Gas.
Whether we're talking about the sunk costs in the CNG facilities or the sunk costs in the pipeline, you're not aware of how the board precedents address that?
Correct.
Okay, well, we will address that in the briefing. I'll represent the Seabrook case, does seem to provide guidance.
My question was about in trying to, and I want to make sure people didn't misunderstand it, in trying to figure out how much benefit there is to this project, Dr. Hopkins was suggesting that we not look at what money that was already spent by the CNG customers that who have already converted over, and I was suggesting and others are, like the company is suggesting we shouldn't do that, we should make believe they didn't convert. And I was suggesting that perhaps since they've already spent the money, we shouldn't ignore that.
Yeah, and I jumped from that. I missed the link. I didn't
Okay.
address the link in between.
All right.
Sorry. Just, this question just refers to the sunk costs in phase one. You're not aware of any board precedent that addresses that, and you're not aware that there's a board policy in the precedents that encourages utilities to rethink or continually reconsider their investments as they go along. And because of that smart management, it has the board precedent has a presumption that the utility will recover 50% of its sunk costs. You're not aware of that?
I'm not aware of that.
You answered Mr. Young's questions about addressing CNG by saying it didn't seem appropriate to change the frame of reference from 2013, correct? You used the term frame of reference?
Yeah, I think I probably use that term.
What did you mean by frame of reference?
What I meant was a fundamental change in baseline of what you're comparing against what.
It's what we in the vernacular call apples to apples. Is that what you meant?
That if in the past you compared apples to apples, that you should continue to compare apples to apples.
And you agree the board's decision in 2013, the metric they used was 20-year NPV, correct?
I understand from, particularly from having had you, when you were walking through a range of examples yesterday, refreshed my memory, that the facts of the analysis that were presented to the board in that docket, or in this docket, but in an earlier proceeding portion of it, were 20-year NPV numbers. The board has to rely, as far as I understand it, on the information that's presented to it. If someone had presented 35-year data or 70-year data or other durations, the board could have chosen to rely on that. My sense from the testimony and the facts in the earlier version of this proceeding are that generally analyses were presented on a 20-year basis.
And so if we were to base a decision now on 35-year or, as Mr. Heap said, 55-year NPV, that would be changing the frame of reference.
I don't think I agree with that.
Thank you.
Following up on the chair's questions regarding the evaluation and consideration of industrial customers using compressed natural gas, do you agree that in general an evaluation of benefits of fuel switching would include what the current fuel is as an input?
As a general matter, yes.
And you also agree that in this situation, the current fuel for a number of customers, or the larger industrial customers, is different than it was in September of 2013?
That's my understanding.
Thank you.
Dr. Hopkins, if I could, you were indicating in an answer to Mr. Dumont that you did not believe it was the same frame of reference, or it was back to that set of questions. You said you couldn't agree with that characterization. I wonder if you could explain why.
Let me try to go back a minute in my mind. There's a difference between changing the fundamental baseline for the analysis and changing which, when you do a cost-benefit analysis of the sort that we're presenting here, you can look at it over 20 years or 21 or 22 or 5 or 72. Those are all just different metrics or pieces of data about one piece of analysis. And that piece of analysis fundamentally has a baseline and a case to which you're comparing that to that baseline. So saying that the presented facts at one point were based on 20 years of comparing basically with pipeline and without. And then in the current set of numbers before the board, you have 20-year numbers as well as 35-year numbers and some longer numbers. The baseline of no pipeline should remain the same baseline to which you're comparing your scenarios, just that the metrics that you might use in that comparison, there are many metrics you might use. You could use output or GDP. We've had that conversation here. You could take present values over different times or with different discount rates. Those are all just different ways of characterizing that single comparison between a case and a baseline. So changing the frame of reference would be actually changing that fundamental comparison rather than changing which metrics you're using to evaluate that analysis and the outcomes of that analysis.
Any other follow-up? Okay, I think we're ready for Mr. Dismukes.
Sorry.
Is there a redirect?
Oh, no, sir.
Okay. Maybe we'll take our 3 o'clock break now, actually. It's 15 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I have marked his pre-filed testimony with the attached exhibits A and exhibits DED 1 through 5, and his rebuttal testimony with the exhibits DED 1 through 6. The number 4 has a 4A and a 4B with it.
Okay, and they're admitted. Is the witness available for cross-examination?
He's right there.
Yes, good afternoon, Dr. Dismukes. So I've taken your deposition, and so we've had some conversations about your testimony. You have not previously provided testimony regarding the net economic benefits of a natural gas expansion project, correct?
Correct.
And it's true that the closest thing or most comparable analysis that you've undertaken was testimony that you submitted in New Jersey before the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities concerning a natural gas pipeline replacement program, correct?
I think that would be correct, yes, ma'am.
Okay, and that's what you testified to during your deposition, correct?
Yes, ma'am. I believe that's correct.
And in fact, you characterized the analysis that you performed there as the exact same template that you see here. Do you recall that?
Yes, ma'am.
And the testimony in New Jersey that you were referring to, you did provide us with copies following the deposition of the testimony that you were referring to. Do you have in front of you Exhibit Petitioner Rebuttal RWH 8-5, I'm sorry, the supplemental testimony in the New Jersey matter? If you don't have it, I've got a copy for you.
I do not have a copy of that.
Mr. Dumont, this was a rebuttal exhibit of Mr. Heaps. It's the New Jersey testimony and the document that...
Why don't you give it to him? Sure.
Thank you. Just take a minute to review that, and if you can tell me, is that the same pipeline replacement program that you were referring to in your deposition?
Yes, ma'am, I appear to see.
Okay. Now, with your testimony in this proceeding, you have provided an attachment A, your resume, consisting of approximately 53 pages, is that correct?
Yes, ma'am.
This New Jersey testimony is not listed in your resume, correct?
It may have been omitted. I don't recall. I haven't gone through and checked.
Well, Dr. Dismukes, you were aware when I took your deposition that this was not listed on your resume, correct?
I didn't memorize the deposition transcript. It's on.
Cannot hear the witness.
How about now?
Good.
I hear you now.
would you accept, subject to check, that this exhibit, or this exhibit, which is testimony you filed in New Jersey, is not listed on your 53-page resume?
Yes, ma'am, I can agree, subject to check.
Thank you. Could you turn to page 16 of what's been marked as RWH 5, your supplemental testimony before the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities?
Yes, ma'am.
And here it's accurate to say that you were critiquing a report provided by the utility in that case for what they called their Energy Strong program for pipeline replacement, correct?
Yes, ma'am, with a clarification that the report was done by consultants for the utility.
Thank you. And in that case, beginning at line 18 on page 16, one of the criticisms you made was that the company calculated benefits for 10 years and you recommended a full 40-year analysis to be consistent with the life of the asset. Isn't that accurate?
That's not my recommendation. I think what I'm saying here is that the company, when they did their analysis, or their consultants had done the analysis for them, they had only used a 10-year period as opposed to the 40-year period that was used by the company that not only goes across these ED investments, but also were the baseline and time period over which the rate impacts were done too. So in order to keep the rate impacts, i.e. the costs associated with the program consistent with the benefits, you needed to keep them consistent with how the company calculated them, which in this instance was over the life of those assets.
Okay, and so you stated the company only calculates benefits for a 10-year period, not the full 40-year asset life associated with the company's proposed ED investments. That's your statement on line 19 and 20, correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's what it says.
Okay. And do you recall in your deposition that I asked you why your analysis, which of the project's net economic benefits, which has been marked as Exhibit Schedule DED3, whether you stopped at 35 years because you felt that the project benefits ended at 35 years. Do you recall that?
Do you have a page and line number of the deposition? I can go over it. I remember the discussion. I don't remember the specifics.
If you can return to page 15. Beginning on line 10, I ask you, and here's my question, why did you stop at year 35? Is it because you expect there to be, is it because you don't expect there to be any energy savings after year 35? Do you see that?
Yes, I see that.
And your answer was no, not at all.
Right.
Okay. So you didn't stop, and then your answer goes on to say, there were two representations in my analysis there for 20 and then for 35 years. You see that?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And you testified that the rate impact numbers, and I'm referring to page 16, you say that the rate impact numbers start to flip to the more positive side beginning in year 34. Do you recall that? And if you refer yourself to page 16, lines, yes. Correct. And you referenced that as and then I'm reading from lines 8 to 10, you say that there will be a bias towards the positive side of the ledger in those years post year 34, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And it's also true that for your rate impact analysis in your exhibit DED3, you simply took the results from Miss Similarity spreadsheets with no adjustments, correct?
That is correct.
And going back to the New Jersey testimony that you provided, in that proceeding, beginning at page 22, you referred the commission in that case to the discount rate guidance provided by the White House Office of Management and Budget, correct?
Yes.
Your testimony in this proceeding does not reference the guidance provided by the Office of Management and Budget at all, does it?
No, it does not. I think this was an issue that was raised and was done particular to this particular proceeding. I think it was originally raised by the authors of the Brattle report, and we went back and looked at the details associated with the OMB circulars related to how these discount rates should be applied, and kind of fleshed out the details associated with that.
Well, actually, when I look at your testimony on page 22, beginning at line 9, it looked to me that you were countering the fact that the Brattle report in that case used a 1% and 4% discount rate, and you brought to the Commission's attention guidance by the OMB in rebuttal. Isn't that accurate?
Yeah, but I believe that the Brattle report raised this issue initially. I think it was cited in their particular report, as I recall.
Okay. Let me, I'll come back to that in a minute. In the New Jersey, in your testimony in the New Jersey proceeding concerning the Energy Strong program, you found that the proposed project in that case, as proposed by the company, the investment would produce a net economic loss, correct?
Yes, ma'am, that's correct.
And then during your deposition, I asked you to identify other types of energy projects where you had performed a net economic benefit analysis. Do you recall that?
Yes, ma'am, I did.
And you referred me to page 38 of your resume, which is attachment A.
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have that with you?
Yes, ma'am.
And you referred me to several different testimonies that you've previously provided where you performed a net economic benefit analysis. One was item 14 on page 37, actually, which involved a solar generation program, investments for an extension of a solar generation program, and that was a proceeding before the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities.
Yes, ma'am.
And in that case, your net economic benefit analysis concluded that that investment would produce negative benefits, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And then number 15 on page 38 involved again before the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities, a proposal for approval of a solar loan program by the utility. And again, in that proceeding, you recommended, based on your analysis, or you concluded that that program would result in a net economic loss, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And number 16 that you referred me to is testimony before the New Jersey Board of Public Utilities concerning a petition of Fisherman's Atlantic City Wind Farm for approval of an offshore wind project, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And again, in that proceeding, you found that the proposed project would result in a net economic loss, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you have in front of you what's been marked as Exhibit Petitioner Cross 6/22/15, June 22/15 AARP-5?
Yes.
And I asked you about this during your deposition as well. This is a draft report that you prepared for the State of Louisiana Public Service Commission concerning that state's solar net metering program, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And in this draft report, your analysis showed that the net metering program resulted in a net economic loss, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And so with this, the Louisiana net metering analysis that you performed, and then the only net benefit analysis that you referred me to in your resume, in all instances you found a negative net benefit for the projects that you've evaluated, correct?
For most of those, I think there's an important caveat that I think I also mentioned in my deposition when we were discussing these issues, is that those results were all contingent upon the proposals that were offered by the utility in those particular proceedings. In most all of those proceedings that you discussed, those solar proceedings, the offshore wind proceeding, et cetera, we ultimately, on behalf of my client, were able to enter into settlements that significantly reduce the scope of that and bring those costs and benefits into alignment for ratepayers during that process. So I think it would be a mischaracterization to come in and suggest that somehow or another I like to come in and rain on everybody's parade, so to speak, when it comes to doing that economic benefit analyses. They're all contingent on the size and the scope of those programs and terms and conditions of those programs. And in each of those instances that we talked about before, we were able to scope those programs down to areas and levels where they were in ratepayer benefits.
Okay, thank you. Let's look at your exhibit DED3. It's for the mechanics of the categories of economic impacts that you've evaluated in this case. There are 4 essential categories that you included in your net benefit analysis, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
Construction impacts with your total appearing on column D, energy savings, rate impacts, and then what you call FO LPG provider impact, which is fuel oil, liquid propane gas provider impact, is that right?
Petroleum gas.
Oh, petroleum gas, thank you. And it's true, isn't it, that the first 2 categories, the construction impacts and the energy savings, you reach net economic benefits or positive numbers, correct?
Yes, ma'am.
And for provider impacts, for example, for year 35, you're showing 142.5 million in net loss, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Of the net benefit analysis where you've previously provided testimony, the cases we were just talking about, you had not previously included a provider impact component to that analysis, correct?
Yeah, because the provider in those instances, the utility, wasn't losing any jobs.
You did not, but those were the only instances in your resume where you've provided testimony that you referred me to for having completed a net economic benefit analysis for an energy project, correct?
Yes, ma'am. And in each of those instances, the utilities weren't anticipating losing revenues or losing jobs or incurring any negative economic impacts for that. In fact, in most instances, they were actually making the proposals. In the solar examples, for instance, the utility would have had a big component of that, and part of the economic impact would have been incurred within the utility sector proper, particularly with regards to the one that we talked about on the pipeline replacement programs in particular, but also with the solar loan programs, because the utilities were the ones facilitating the loan program and doing a lot of the administrative work associated with that, and also with the Solar for All programs, which had some competitive bidding components to it. And in fact, I think a quarter of the program investment was associated with grid-connected, well, not grid-scale projects, but projects that were being installed by the utility, in this instance PSE&G. Some of you may be familiar with the Solar for All program that they had there, where they were putting PV panels on utility poles around the service territory. So those were direct installs and benefits that they would actually do.
Dr. Dismukes, can you speak into the microphone? We do have some people in the back who are indicating they cannot hear.
Okay, sorry.
Okay, again, and I asked you a very direct question that you had not included a provider impact component in that analysis. You kind of went on way beyond the question that I asked.
Okay, let me try to answer it. No, because it was not relevant.
Okay, and notwithstanding that it was not relevant, you still produced a net economic loss.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. The net energy savings that you've calculated in Exhibit DED3, for the 35-year NPV, you reflect a number of $188.56 million, correct? A net benefit number?
Where are you now?
I'm on Exhibit DED3, column H, the total for energy savings, and there's a 35-year NPV.
Okay. Yes, and it's $188 and $188.56. Sorry.
And I believe in your testimony you indicated that you used the most recent April 2015 oil prices published by the DPS as the starting point for that analysis, correct?
I think I misspoke. I think it was the 2014 annual energy outlook.
I'm sorry, 2014 what?
Annual energy outlook.
Well, let me understand this, Dr. Dismukes. There were two things that you did with your energy savings calculation. You had a starting price, and then you had a price that you trended it with, correct?
Correct.
Is your testimony that you used the April 2014 starting price?
No, I used the most recent April numbers that were provided by the state's fuel reporter and then grew those by the percentages that were included in the AEO, or the annual energy outlook.
And the prices and the AEO, the annual energy outlook that you used was the 2014 data, not the most current 2015 data, right?
Correct.
You didn't feel that it was important to use the most current information, the most current EIA data for trending the prices out?
At the time that we did the study, I think the release was coming out about that week or within that 2-week period that I was preparing the testimony, and I just overlooked the update when we did this.
This additional uncertainty has been shown to imply effective discount rates lower than those based on the observed average market interest rates, regardless of whether or not the estimated investment effects are predominantly measured as private capital or consumption terms, correct?
Correct.
And, okay, that's all I have.
To go off the record for a minute, so to talk about scheduling, and maybe to take a short break, and we're planning to meet going on if that's what parties want to do, and try to finish today. Is that what parties would like to do?
Yes.
Okay.
Are you kidding?
Why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then you can consult with your witness and then come back with your
I think Mr. Duke wants to consider this. He's being very
Okay, so we might go with late 7 o'clock.
Oh, yeah, he does.
Dismukes, you were asked a question based on a transcript from June 14th, pre-file testimony dated June 14th, 2013, somebody named Edward Picolar, P-C-O-L-A-R. And you were asked, are you aware that all of the fuel oil is purchased from Quebec? Remember that question?
Yes, sir.
And I objected and asked to see the exhibit that she was reading from?
Yes, sir.
I'm going to read you the next sentence that she didn't read.
Okay.
The plant also received 80 tanker trucks, 750,000 gallons of dryer fuel, propane, shipped from Selkirk, New York, and Berlin, Vermont, at a cost of $1 million. So, combining the first sentence, which Attorney Hayden read you, and the second sentence, which I'm reading you, how does that compare to the leakage rate on the in-plan model?
Well, I don't know the specific number, but when you put the two together, it would connote a much smaller leakage than what was implied earlier, which sounded like something around the order of 100%, which is not necessarily the case.
My second redirect question is, you've been asked a lot of questions today about why don't you use $100 a ton for a carton? If you could refer to page 42 of your rebuttal testimony, May 27th.
Yes, sir.
Where you asked, would your revised results shift to a positive net economic benefit if you utilized a $100 per ton environmental cost adder? And your answer was, no, the results would continue to be negative even if I used $100 per ton. The use of $100 per ton value still results in a negative net economic benefit in economic output terms of negative $109.3 million NPV over a 20-year period, of negative $104.5 million NPV.
Oh, sorry, I lost you.
Sorry, I'll slow down. Of negative $104.5 million over a 35-year period, and negative $90.4 million NPV over a 70-year period. Did I get that right?
Yes, sir.
Is there anything you want to add to that?
No, sir.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. You're excused. We're ready for Mr. Cota.
Hello, Mr. Cota.
Hello.
I'll just remind you, I believe you've already testified in this docket and that you remain under oath. No?
Don't think I
You
am.
have not? All right.
No,
then.
I haven't, no, I
Oh, okay, great. I'll
couldn't
now
testify.
swear you in,
Thanks.
Chance. And even if you have, you can be sworn in.
Okay, I'll be sworn.
Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
On page 11, at line 10, you refer to footnote 19, and you refer to attachment F. As you do refer to the other attachments, unfortunately, it's not labeled attachment F. It's the last page. And we'd ask that the board consider that attachment F. The other ones are labeled, everything else is labeled as just an error that we didn't put attachment F on it.
Okay, great. I think that's how we'll treat it, as attachment F. And if there's no objection, then the testimony and exhibits are admitted. So now we're ready for cross-examination. Thank you. Ms. Hayden?
Thank you. Mr. Cota, do you have the one cross-exhibit that the petitioner provided to you and your counsel this morning?
I don't have it in my possession, but I am familiar with the document.
Can I hand this to the witness just to verify, Mr. Sadek?
Sure.
On page 5, or page 5 of your testimony, line 5, and footnote 5, you refer to an article by a Stanford economist, correct?
That's correct.
And is that the exhibit that I've just handed you?
That is correct.
And that is marked as, can you just read the exhibit reference? I don't have it in front of me now.
Exhibit petitioner cross 62215, VFDA 1, docket number 7970.
Thank you. I move the admission of the exhibit, and I have no further questions.
No objection.
Okay, it's admitted. Mr. Gray, do you have questions for this witness?
No, I do not, thank you.
Okay. I don't believe anybody else signed up for cross for this witness, is that correct? Just, do you have questions?
Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead.
Good afternoon, Mr. Cota.
Good afternoon.
There was a question that you were promised you were going to be asked earlier, so I'm going to go ahead and ask it now and just expand it a little bit. Do you know how many people are employed in the state of Vermont in the home heating oil and propane delivery industry?
That's a great question, and one that we considered spending resources on to determine through an economic expert. I'm personally not an economic expert. The only Remy I know is Jerry Remy. And Yankees fans here. But we've considered that. However, when we were allowed to gain party status in this case in the spring of 2013, one of the we were only admitted limited scope, and that limited scope was we couldn't talk about job losses as they relate to the heating fuel industry. I have a good grasp of my membership base and the structure of those businesses, the size of those businesses, and the number of employees and the wages they pay, but I've not done a comprehensive survey. We have not paid an economist to do a comprehensive survey of all the jobs touched by those in the heating, oil, and propane industry.
Okay, well, it sounds like you have a ballpark figure you could give us then.
Yeah, we have 232 members that pay dues to my small nonprofit trade association that represents heating fuel and heating service companies. And based on our survey, unscientific survey methodology, we know, and based on other surveys that we've seen of other New England markets, the average company has 20 employees. We're mostly second, third, fourth generation family-owned companies that, and we're labor intensive compared to other heating fuels such as natural gas or electricity. It takes 20 employees, and not just the driver, but the heating technician and the customer service staff and the regulatory compliance people and the people that pay the taxes and pay the bills. It takes 20 employees, to service 2,000 customers, which is the average heating fuel dealer's customer base.
Okay, so what's your ballpark figure?
So if you're just talking about heating fuel,
The direct employees,
where we're talking about 150 approximately different heating oil and propane companies that are domiciled in Vermont. Heating service, which services the oil heat companies, is addition, and all the ancillary companies that provide trucks and accounting and insurance and rubber gloves. So we've got 150 different companies domiciled in Vermont with the average of 20 employees. That's how many people directly sell fuel. That's a ballpark, not done by any economic survey.
You mentioned the number 232 members, and how does that relate to the 150 companies?
Well, many, we're a nonprofit trade association, so you don't have to sell heating fuel to be a member of the Vermont Fuel Dealers Association, certainly. We also provide technical training for 1,000 heating technicians every year. So heating service companies, which tend to be smaller than heating fuel companies, join in order to get our propane and oil heat training. We also have companies that sell trucks. There are 5 different companies in Vermont that sell trucks directly to the heating fuel dealers, or they sell insurance, or they sell gloves, or they sell hoses, or they sell pumps, or they sell boilers or furnaces ad nauseum.
Thank you. I have one more question. On pages 12, actually 2 more questions. At page 6 of your pre-file testimony, at lines 4 and 5, you state that the average quote for oil heat to gas conversion is about $12,000. How did you derive that figure?
Well, that's a low number. One of the things that we do, our member companies do all the time, 70% of the oil heat companies sell propane gas in Vermont. Those companies do oil to gas conversions every day. So they're very familiar with the requirements under the law to remove not only the oil tank, but the vent and fill pipe and all associated piping, to line the chimney when you switch to one fuel source to the other as required by NFPA 31, it's now National Fire Prevention Association code book. And then the cost of the actual equipment, not putting on a conversion burner, but removing the old boiler or furnace and putting in a new boiler furnace. $12,000 is a bargain. It can run as high as $18,000 depending on the complication. And
this is when you're actually replacing the entire system.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you. On pages 12 and 13 of your pre-filed testimony, you discuss a federal energy policy known as the Renewable Fuel Standard, RFS, which requires a blending of up to 20% biodiesel into conventional
Microphone,
fuel.
please.
Yeah.
Excuse me. Could you describe what impact, if any, the RFS has on heating fuels sold in Vermont?
The RFS has changed our industry tremendously, as has a law that was originally that passed in 2011, part of the Vermont Energy Act of 2011, which required us to sell a low sulfur fuel. combining a low sulfur fuel with biodiesel blended heating oil has allowed us to remain competitive in markets where people want a cleaner and greener fuel. We needed a state regulation in order to change the sulfur content, to reduce our sulfur from what had been 2,000 parts per million to eventually will be 15 parts per million, the same sulfur content that you have in clean diesel being sold in the on-road market.
Is there a projected date when heating fuels sold in Vermont will achieve the 20% biodiesel objective?
Well, they can sell it today.
So there is biodiesel at a rate consistent for all biodiesel, or all fuel, there's enough biodiesel being sold in Vermont now to achieve that statewide?
No. So what is the case is that biodiesel can be blended up to 20%, meaning 80% petrol oil, 20% biodiesel, and can be still labeled as oil heat. RFS, the effect of RFS is that the major oil companies have to meet the renewable energy goals. They found a good market to dump 100% biodiesel, and because if you look at the New York Harbor over the past 3 years, that their average of the last 3 years, that biodiesel, B100, has been 22 cents less per gallon than heating oil. The major oil producers who are under strict regulations from the EPA to blend renewable fuel into their downstream supply have found a great market for that. We're the beneficiary of that, allowing us to sell biodiesel into the market.
To support the degree to which that phenomenon has impacted Vermont fuel oil buyers?
That is a fundamental problem, and one that we have addressed the legislature, but not successfully. Our upstream market, the wholesalers, they're not selling it to us as a green product. They're selling it to us pure arbitrage. If you can buy a product that's 22 cents less per gallon than another product and then blend it in, you're going to blend it to the max. And that's what we experienced.
But you really don't know.
You would have to test every batch. And we have had high-level discussions with our wholesalers and with lawmakers and with Department of Public Service about how we could achieve that, so we could claim the GHG savings and the green mantle from doing that. We're not at that point yet. But here's what we do know: 20% biodiesel blended into the heating oil supply there's no difference in operations. The consumer wouldn't know the difference when they turn on the thermostat.
Thank you.
Okay. Any redirect? Or any follow-up questions? Sorry.
Mr. Gray, I think we're up to your witnesses now.
Yes.
Good afternoon, Ms. Wilson. Hi. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you are about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth? I do.
Could you state your name, please?
Yeah, my name is Barbara Wilson.
And have you already submitted pre-filed testimony in this proceeding?
Absolutely.
Okay. It's been identified as NP2R Wilson, Exhibit 1 through 17. And I believe that the board has been provided with copies. The court reporter was provided a complete set.
Those are my exhibits.
Those are your exhibits?
Yeah.
And
there's a pre-filed testimony.
Pre-filed testimony has also been provided. So I would move the admission of Ms. Wilson's pre-filed testimony and exhibits.
Any objection? They're admitted.
The witness is now available for cross-examination.
Okay, and my understanding is no one has questions for this witness? We do, so we'll start.
I don't think I got it. Okay.
Ms. Wilson, just a moment. We have a little bit of confusion about some exhibits. Wilson, you have 17 exhibits attached to your testimony. Is that not right?
Yes, I do.
Thank you. That's what we're clarifying up here at the bench.
Okay.
So good afternoon formally, Ms. Wilson. My name is June Tierney, and I'll be asking you a few questions about your testimony.
Okay.
Welcome, first off, to the Public Service Board. I don't believe I've seen you here before as a witness. That takes me to my first point. Having examined your testimony, I have the impression that you do not have in your professional background any experience in utility rate making. Is that correct?
No, I don't.
And also not in utility rate design, is that correct?
Correct.
Do you have an understanding of what both of those disciplines are?
I have an understanding.
Can you tell me briefly what that is?
As far as, obviously, when there is public infrastructure, this capital going to be spent, right? Obviously, we have to look at it from the benefit of, you know, the public of Vermont, as we've been talking about, what the costs are associated with that, and what the impact is, and what are the economic benefits, and that's the purpose of, you know, what's been going on here. I'd like to add, though, I've never said in here that I'm an expert. All I've done is gone through and looked at the financials associated with spreadsheets that Vermont Gas provided. You know, so I'm not doing anything about, you know, making any statements about regulatory, whatever. I'm just looking at, you know, formulas. I'm a math major by, you know, as a math major, I'm a product manager. I've managed $20 million annual products. And so I've lived in spreadsheets, so it's
I definitely have that impression from looking at your testimony and your analysis. So have no fear, and I have no question that you're much more competent with math than I am, I can assure you. But I just wanted to get a sense of what your understanding is of utility rate making and rate design, because you do testify about those subjects, and I'm going to ask you a few questions about that. Okay. Do you have your testimony there?
I sure do.
Great. Can we go to page 13 of your testimony, line 15? In that area you testify, it is clear from this graph that the only real winners are the G3 and G4 rate schedule customers. Do you see that?
I sure do.
And could you just clarify for me, the G3 and G4 rate schedules that you looked at, I assume, to make that statement, are they the ones that are presently in place for Vermont Gas?
What I did in my analysis is looked at solely the data that was included in the spreadsheets, the financial spreadsheets that Vermont Gas provided, and those were, you know, the individuals that were projected to take gas rates.
So you didn't go to the website and look at schedules for rates for classes G3 and G4?
I looked at pricing schedules for, definitely, they're available on the Vermont Gas website.
Okay, so that's what I'm asking. You did go there then?
Oh, absolutely. I've been doing that since April or May of last year.
Okay. And those things, so in other words, your analysis is not strictly derived from what was in Vermont Gas's spreadsheets, but rather you also went to their website and you looked at their tariff sheets, is that
Absolutely, as well as DPS website fuel prices.
Great. So then, with that understanding, the conclusion that you articulate in your testimony about the real winners, that's based on your perusal of the existing G3 and G4 rate schedules, is that correct?
It's that, but more importantly, what it is looking at, you know, the costs associated with this project for those particular individuals and the savings that they'll get. And the way that I did that was I looked at the funds use sheet that Vermont Gas provided. I mean, they provided a lot of data. It took me a whole lot of time to sort through it, believe me. And then also you have the market analysis information. So you had the ability to be able to isolate the revenue between market class. So that's what I did. So I basically created additional lines and spreadsheets to be able to separate that out, make sure it added up to the total, and did that.
Great.
And then okay.
And that's very helpful for me to understand. Question for you, if these rate schedules were to change in the future, would you agree that it's also possible that the category of customers that you're characterizing as winners could also change?
That could happen, but if you look at the actual rates that, you know, residential versus G1 versus G2, 3, 4, there's considerable difference between what they pay for gas.
Now let me ask you about that, because that difference, I'll submit to you, we characterize as rate design.
Yeah.
Okay. So if the rate design were to change in the future, would you agree that it's possible that your category of winners would also change?
Oh, it could, yeah. Absolutely. It's based on historical data that was available. So I looked at rates that were in effect as of May, June, July, August, you know, through current, on both sides.
If I could ask you to turn to page 18 of your testimony. Actually, it's the passage, page 18 through 19 and 21, and 20. I'll be asking you a couple of questions about that. On page 19 of your testimony, you feature a pie chart and then I'm going to call a chart below that. Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
And to the right-hand side, you have an item called SURF Fund.
Mm-hmm.
And I understood that to be a reference to a fund that was created in docket 7712. Am I understanding you correctly?
Yes, but it's really what was reported, once again, on that fund use sheet.
That's fine. So the question I have for you is this. Your analysis here, I think, assumes that there will be withdrawals from that fund in the course of recovering costs for the project. Is that correct?
It assumes what was assumed on the fund use sheet. And the fund use sheet basically brought in the revenue that's coming in from new Addison customers at the top. It then had the operational cost. It then did simple math, and it came up with the COS, which was negative. And then they basically applied the fund to that, and then also had the area up at the top where they identified the 15.3 and the minus 4% rate.
Fair enough. Now, this graph and the pie chart appear in a passage of your testimony that is labeled Fund Use Analysis of Who Pays What. And my question to you is simply this: are you aware, or were you aware when you gave us that testimony, that no withdrawals from that fund have been authorized by this board to date?
Yeah, and that's fine, and that's fine. Again, I was really reporting on what the fund use, what that chart was telling me.
I appreciate that. Thank you. If I could ask you to turn to page 35 of your testimony. If I could ask you to go to lines 17 through 19 for a moment. You testify there, at most it provides a major economic benefit to less than 2.5% of the addressable market in Middlebury and Vergennes at the expense of all other existing ratepayers in the state. And by it, I gather the references to the pipeline, as the sentence before makes clear. Question for you there. In making that statement in your testimony, did you consider the possibility that later rate making or rate design proceedings could affect how the costs of the project are allocated and paid for?
What I was really focused on is what had been provided as data. What I wasn't doing is an economic analysis. I'm no economist. I know that. I'm a product manager.
And you're not a rate maker either.
And I'm a berry farmer, you know. So you know, but I'm good at math. So what this 2.5 represents is really, you know, if you looked at the total number of folks that are included, projected to be included in our residential G1, 2, 3, and 4, and you look at G3 and G4, and it's obvious they get massive savings right from day one. So that was the 2.5% I was talking of the total of all the projected customers, target market, or you know, the take rate that would happen.
Thank you. I have no further questions. Mr. Young, did you have a question, or did you?
Good afternoon, Ms. Wilson.
Hi.
Let me start by asking something not on your testimony, but in your resume.
Okay.
It indicates you're at Telcordia.
I was Telcordia. Now they were sold to Ericsson.
Sold to Ericsson?
Ericsson. Yeah, a couple of years, 2011, we got sold.
So you're now with Ericsson as opposed to
I'm a
Telcordia.
contractor now. I retired just before it happened, after having gone through divestiture, several changes in the corporation. I decided I don't think I want to be an employee with this round, and I'm kind of glad since they're offshoring most of my team right now. So.
I just wanted to make sure, since they're now in charge of porting telephone numbers, I wanted to make sure that there wasn't going to be a secondary effect if you didn't like what we did.
Oh, all right. I wish. I'm not in that part.
It may be.
I get trending and performance management.
Let me move you to your exhibit 7-2.
Okay.
And I'm just going to look at the residential part, which is the top segment of this table. I'll give you a couple seconds to get there.
Thank you.
And as I look at this, and the customer, what you're presenting here is a customer who uses 700 gallons of oil, who switches to natural gas. The average, are these average annual fuel costs you're showing?
Over 10 years, yeah.
It's over 10 years, but these are the
Yeah.
average annual, correct?
Mm-hmm.
So at that level, you're showing almost no savings for a customer.
Correct.
Now, I assume you've read the other testimony in this proceeding, and Mr. Rendell indicated that the average customer was saving, I believe his testimony was around $1,700. Is there any way you can help me to reconcile his $1,700 versus, at least for the low volume customer, which some people are using a number around this is the average,
right,
of $200?
Yeah, I actually, that's what got me started in doing this. Way back in, we were part of phase 2, and so I was seeing ads, and I was like, I don't understand this. So what I did was put together what I call these fuel calculators, right? And basically I have one for every rate class, right? And what I do in these particular calculators, I tie it into the same spreadsheets that VGS provided, right, with the sheet 2, which has the price forecast based on EIA data that's come in. I updated my EI data for 2015. And then, actually, I noticed something very interesting. As soon as I updated it with the 2015 based on the 2014, that all of a sudden the price of oil went like high in this 2015. And because I was just using, as everyone else in the docket seemed to be back early on, you know, is like, well, what's, you know, the price of the oil in the February report or the November report and all that kind of stuff, right? And when I looked at that, I said, oh, the EIA data for 2015, it actually goes down to -27 because of it's basically trending with what we've seen in oil prices, right? So if in fact you go in and you're using like January's number there, right, against that EIA data, and if it's higher, it's going to then take 11% for 2016 based on the EIA data that's projected, and it's going to cause that to go up so that the price was like $3.20 or even more, which didn't seem reasonable. So from a common sense perspective, I started to think about, well, you know, these are, as a math major, right? I said, oh, but you know, these trends are based on annual averages, right? So wouldn't it make better sense to go back and look at 2014, which is the year we just completed and had a full year of oil price for, do an average of that, right? And at first I was afraid to do that because I was like, oh my God, the average is $3.65 or whatever I'm doing from memory. It was $3.60 something. It's going to be horrible, right? Well, no, it adjusted that -27% to that number. It brought it to $2.66.3, which is not too far off of what we are today. And then in 2016, and I can't quite remember the number, I think it's like $2.90 some odd cents. And I'm like, oh, that's modeling precisely what's happening right now. So what we should, to use this EIA data, I believe it's more accurate to use average prices for 2014, trust the EIA data to do the trending projections, because that's what it's for, right? And then do the same thing for gas. Unfortunately, I only started tracking the gas prices since May of last year, so my average was only an 8-month average for the gas, because I strongly believe you got to do apples to apples. You know, so if you're doing one thing, you're looking at it over a calendar year, you should be looking at the other thing over a calendar year. And so by doing that, that's exactly what's being used for these numbers. The other thing that I've done in these numbers is surface, you know, I'm taking the rates as they are published on that website, and they include the SERP fund embedded in those distribution, I believe it is. I don't know that for certain, but I think that's where it is. So my numbers include SERP. They also include, because the customer is paying the subsidy for low income, right? So I put, not that it's that much, it's like $9 a year, it's not that big of a deal. And my numbers also included here what that projected rate increase, because I'm looking at this from the standpoint of the rate increase. But even if, and I just did it, because I have a calculator now, so all I gotta do is change the parameters. So just while I was sitting there, I took out the rate, and it's still like a difference of about $550, which isn't a whole lot of money with zero rate increase, right? That then your conversion costs have to go against that. So when you look at that chart on the left-hand side, that isn't adjusted for conversion cost at all. The only time I do any kind of adjustments is scenario 4, where I actually subtract out of that average the $264 lease fee. Because that's something that they're always, paying every month associated with the fuel. So I believe that explains part of it. I also then looked at Dr. Hopkins' testimony, and actually had I had a chance to, basically do any kind of, this morning I handed out that composite that we never used and got to. And in that, what this particular composite shows, if you look at his data and you flip to that very last page, the other thing that's kind of weird was he put his 1401 in column 2016 instead of putting it in 2015, right? And then it didn't apply the 2016 2.7 increase to it, which I thought was kind of odd. And the other difference between my numbers and his is the fact he did this 5-month average, which was December, January, February, March, and April, right? And I did the calendar year 2004 average. So his average, he in 2015 isn't, using that minus 27, right? So my average for my number for 2016 or for 2015 is less than what his is, and I'm letting EIA data do the adjustments, and I'm not explaining that very well. I'm sorry.
That's okay.
Can I ask a clarification? You said you used an average for 2004. I believe
14.
14.
Yeah, absolutely 14. I'm sorry. I get tongue-tied with numbers. So that makes a difference as well, and it definitely makes a difference. And that was the thing I saw right in the beginning, why it caused me to go to the average, because I didn't think it was right to apply the 11% to this higher number for the beginning of the year, because fuel prices are oftentimes, if you look at the DPS website, they're oftentimes a little higher January, February, March anyway, right? And it should be a representative yearly average value that you're applying that projection to.
Thank you. That's all the questions I have right now.
Okay. Okay, thank you.
Any follow-up to ours before we get to redirect?
I'm asking the other parties if they have any follow-up to our questions. Okay, then, all right, any redirect?
No.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Ms. Wilson, you're excused.
Yeah.
Felony pilot.
Okay.
Ms. Peyser, I would just like to remind you that you remain under oath from your previous appearance in this document.
Ms. Peyser, you've provided pre-filed testimony on the exhibits, am I correct?
Yes, you must.
Now, with respect to your exhibits, I have them as exhibit 1 through 10. There is no exhibit 11.
Right.
And then you have exhibit 12 through 15, am I correct?
Yes.
Okay. And those have been provided to the parties on the board?
Yes.
Okay. I move the introduction of Ms. Peyser's pre-filed testimony as well as her exhibits. And I'm sorry, did you do pre-filed rebuttal testimony?
Yes, I did.
And were there any exhibits to
The exhibits were, so from 12 through 15 were attached to the rebuttal testimony. The remainder were attached to the pre-filed testimony.
Okay, thank you. So we move the admission of the testimonial exhibits.
Any objection? Okay, they're admitted.
the witnesses available for questioning.
And my understanding is none of the parties had crossed with this witness, so but we have questions.
Good afternoon, Ms. Peyser. June Tierney, we've had the pleasure before in this proceeding. Could I
Please tell me
ask-
you're not going to start with the typos.
I won't if you don't start with my bad math. May I ask you to turn to page 21 of your May 6th testimony? And when you're there, let me know.
And I am looking at the corrected version.
You there? As I reviewed this passage, it seemed to me that you were describing your involvement with a group called Just Power, and it was an outreach activity at the Sustainability Expo. Is that right?
Yes, although it also continued to some other places.
What continued?
So our outreach activities in terms of the survey that I was discussing here.
Excellent. Could you, for the benefit of the record, tell us a little bit about what Just Power is?
Sure. Just Power is a coalition of individuals. Some of them represent organizations. For the most part, it is individuals who are concerned about prosperity in Vermont and a just energy future. They come from all walks of life, genuinely, different professions. They all have a similar concern, although I would say a very varied set of views about what the right way to go forward is. There's a lot of debate and a lot of discussion about policy. So I would say it's a group that was not set up to be a purely advocacy group. It was just simply a group of people. It was originally called the Friday Night Group. That started long before I came home to Vermont. Who used to meet every other Friday night in order to talk about what was happening with energy policy in Vermont.
In that same vein, could I ask you to explain a little bit of what the Sustainability Expo is?
Sure, and I will tell you as I understand it. So it is a sustainability fair that is run in Middlebury, as I understand it, on an annual basis. They have workshops all day. And then they have sort of tabling opportunities for vendors, nonprofits, and others to provide materials, do outreach, talk to people who are attending the expo.
So Just Power was conducting outreach activities at the Sustainability Expo. Can you describe a little bit who Just Power spoke with in those outreach activities? Were these potential residential customers for VGS or who?
We set up a table, so in the main hall, we had a couple of signs, our own Just Power sign, as well as one that said, confused about natural gas, question mark. We had some questions like, is natural gas less expensive, more expensive, et cetera. And we spoke with whomever came up to our table. So we did not, we weren't looking for specific individuals. We had individuals who came up and said that they were interested in natural gas. We tried to have them fill out the survey first before we spoke with them and influence them, because we felt that it was important that we try to just get a sense of people's thinking about natural gas and the types of savings that they would want to achieve. I don't think I included a copy of the survey here, although I don't think there's somebody in the room. One of the residents from Moncton, we also sent it out online to people, filled it out and sent it into the Department of Public Service. So I think that they, their public advocate's office may have seen it. But what I was going to say is that we actually didn't put in any markers. So the questions were, are you interested in natural gas service? And then there was a response. You had 3 choices with sub-responses. So the first was yes, without regard to cost. The second was yes, as long as, and then we left open spaces for people to say, my savings over my current fuel would be more than, and we had a percentage. Or I would reduce CHG by more than. So we are trying not to influence what that answer might be.
I appreciate that. Thank you. That's a helpful description to have. Did you have a sense from, as you dealt with these individuals who came to your booth, did you have any understanding as to whether they were coming to you as potential users of energy in a residential setting as opposed to a commercial or a business setting?
Definitely, I would say the majority of the individuals who came to speak with us were
were talking with us about residential settings. I would say there were a couple of small business owners, and of course, since it was a sustainability expo, we had many individuals who are doing retrofits and other things who stopped by. I'll also say that we had a lot of people who thought we were selling natural gas and advertising for Vermont Gas because of our question, confused about natural gas, written in blue with a black question mark on a white banner. There were a lot of people who said, oh no, we don't want to talk to you because you're from the pipeline. And then we had people who said, you know, hi, yeah, I do want to find out about a gas burner.
Thank you. Can I ask you to turn to page 23 of your testimony? Now, this is not chasing typos, but it is a question about clarification in your testimony.
Absolutely.
Would you please read to yourself lines 14 through 17, the sentence there, and when you're done with that, let me know.
Okay.
Now, on line 15, you used the phrase "was previously incorrect." And I read the sentence to myself several times, and I wondered whether you meant to say "was previously correct."
I think I actually did not.
Okay.
And so my point was that, and unfortunately, it would have been nice if I'd split this into 3 sentences, right? But my point was actually that if you trusted them before, and they created essentially a condition precedent, that if the following things happened, there would not be sufficient demand for natural gas. That if you believed them before, there's no reason not to believe them, that now, when that condition precedent has actually come to pass, you should still believe them, that they were right then, that there probably isn't enough demand for natural gas now.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you to turn to page 27 of your May 6th testimony? At lines 7 and 9, if you would look at that quickly.
Okay.
So you follow that sentence about what the board found with the statement, "This is no longer the case."
Mm-hmm.
And the context is that a VGS witness testified earlier in the case that Addison County has no natural gas infrastructure, and therefore there would be a need to install a network.
Right.
Okay. And you're saying this is no longer the case. Are you saying in this passage of your testimony that trucked natural gas service and piped natural gas service are comparable and thus interchangeable?
No.
Okay.
Well, actually, let me think about that. Okay. Now that the Palmers have a lawyer, I would advise to think before I speak.
Gotta be something.
No, I think that I was actually taking the first sentence in a literal fashion, that there was no natural gas infrastructure. So I was not actually distinguishing, I was taking that in the absolute literal sense, that there was none and there is some now.
So it's the infrastructure that you're focusing on, and what exactly?
And natural gas infrastructure.
And so what I would have understood Mr. Texera's testimony to be is that there's no pipe infrastructure right now.
Right, and I would say that there is now, in the sense that there is now some distribution lines running from a gas island to customers.
So then let me ask you again, is it your view that with the availability of CNG in Addison County now, at least in that particular location in Middlebury, that trucked natural gas service and piped natural gas service are comparable and therefore interchangeable?
No, I would not say that they are fully interchangeable, but similarly to the extent to which natural gas would be fully interchangeable with oil and propane, they are another choice and an option that would be available, except that there are some restrictions because of MOUs that have been previously signed.
Could I ask you to turn to page 30 of your testimony, please? At lines 14 and 15 of that page, you testify, "I should mention here that International Paper began receiving bids for the provision of trucked LNG or CNG back last summer." And then you conclude this paragraph with, Moreover, VGS should have already been aware of the fact that trucked CNG was the lowest cost alternative to meet demand for natural gas in Addison County for VGS and for current ratepayers. Could you tell me?
I'm sorry, could you tell me which line I'm looking at
Yes.
again? I think I'm not looking in the right place.
Not at all. I'm looking at, in the beginning, I was looking at line 1415 on page 30, and then the final piece that I read was line 19 through 21. I just wanted to clarify a few things about that passage for my own benefit. In that last sentence on line 21, where you refer to current ratepayers, who do you mean by current ratepayers? Did you mean Vermont Gas ratepayers who are served by Vermont Gas's existing system?
Yes.
And when you refer to the lowest cost alternative, should I understand that to mean the least expensive alternative for ratepayers who bear the cost of providing service?
Yes, so as the individuals who would eventually be contributing to the pipeline as customers over time, that the absence of a pipe and delivering by CNG to customers in Addison County would create a lower cost alternative to ratepayers because the asset would not be necessary.
And by your reference to ratepayer there, you mean this would be the lowest cost alternative for folks who want to take natural gas, but it's lowest cost in the sense of cost to be borne by people who are presently ratepayers of Vermont Gas, is that correct?
Right, so I mean that it would be less expensive as a whole for society to have natural gas delivered by truck to customers in Addison County, because if you did not build the asset of the pipeline, there would be no reason to add the cost of that asset into rates. So you wouldn't have the investment in the pipeline, while individuals might pay a slightly higher rate in Addison County for natural gas than they would pay if they were to receive it through pipe. They would not be paying for the asset at all, and you would not have the people who are not cost causers, individuals in Chittenden and Franklin counties, cross-subsidizing an asset that has now become, I would consider, outrageously expensive.
Well, this is what I wanted to understand better about your testimony. What you said just now was that this is lowest cost for society, but your testimony here says lowest cost alternative for VGS and current ratepayers. So should I understand to mean that what you meant to say in your testimony was lowest cost from a societal perspective?
No, I think I am complementing my testimony
okay.
to explain the evolution of my thinking about that. That's okay. Maybe I can just provide a little bit more information that I think would be helpful to clarify. Is that okay?
But this is, I found your answer very helpful, and I think I understand your testimony.
Well, and I think I may have caused another, I don't want you to come to a conclusion that I did not actually mean. So if I could clarify, that would be great.
That's fine by me. Please go ahead.
So I believe that it would, of course, be less expensive as a cost input to Vermont Gas to not build a pipeline, assuming that Vermont Gas would still be selling its gas to an intermediary or a dealer, someone like NG Advantage, which would be selling the gas. So Vermont Gas would actually still be getting the revenue, whether that comes through transportation or the sale of natural gas to NG Advantage or to Enervtech, which would then sell the gas on. Because Vermont Gas's business is a throughput business, and the more you can spread whatever infrastructure you have across ratepayers, the less ratepayers are going to pay for it. They would still have the revenue from either transportation or from selling natural gas to an intermediary provider. That would continue to lower the rates, so you would actually likely have downward pressure on rates for customers in Franklin and Chittenden counties, as well as for new customers in Addison County. You would not have the cost to them of paying for infrastructure that isn't necessary. Vermont Gas would still be able to get its revenue, and perhaps that would mean changing the model in some way. But the fact is it wouldn't be a return on equity. It would be a return on their actual sales, and potentially a return on equity, depending upon whether or not they built additional infrastructure to serve, for example, CNG customers themselves, which I know was under consideration, that they were piloting that as one option that they could consider.
Okay, thank you. Can I ask you to turn to page 17 of your May 6th testimony?
My May 6th.
That's the same testimony we're looking at right now. lines 12 through 15, you testify, quote, "If the majority of VGS customers understood what was going on, they would be opposed to contributing to the SERV." And then you go on to say, "and would be shocked at the reality that they will pay much higher prices so that residents and businesses in Addison County can get piped natural gas with so little savings." I'd like to focus on your statement about what the majority of Vermont gas systems customers know. What is your basis for that statement?
That they don't know?
For your making a statement about what the majority of Vermont gas systems customers understood. Your phrase is, if the majority of VGS customers understood what was going on, they would be opposed to contributing to the SERV. I'd like to understand what your basis is for that statement.
Having done quite a bit of outreach myself in Franklin County and Chittenden counties to ratepayers, as well as Just Power doing that type of outreach, as well as other coalition members doing that outreach. We've been talking to ratepayers for quite some time. And I would say that, just looking around the room, if I'm lying, please somebody raise your hand so I can correct myself. I think that nearly all of the ratepayers with whom we speak are surprised to learn that they are currently paying a gas distribution charge or a portion thereof, and that charge is actually being used to build the transmission line. Let me correct that, just to be clear, that it is not being used yet, but that if the Public Service Board does approve the use of that fund in a separate proceeding, after Vermont Gas has built the pipeline and is ready for gas to flow, that if the Public Service Board approves the charging of costs to that fund, those monies will not be returned to them, or all of those monies will not be returned to them. I mean, a portion could be if there was some leftover. It's not looking that way right now at 154.3 million, right? Or even at the amount of money that has already been spent on development charges, which are in principle have been considered allowable. They haven't been authorized yet. But that if all of those things come to pass, if the project is successful, if the infrastructure is built, or if all of the development expenses for which reimbursement is requested or reimbursed, given the amount that has already been spent to date, that is where that money will go, and that it is actually ratepayer money that was originally meant to have come back a portion in a refund and not to be charged as a rate decrease over time.
Ms. Peyser, I'm trying to focus on your basis for asserting what the majority of VGS
And I
customers
said
would think.
I'm sorry, I can only take one person at a time, so I don't have either of you.
All right, I'm going to start again. I'm trying to get to the basis of your statement as to what the majority of Vermont gas systems customers would think. Your statement that they would be opposed to contributing to the SERV if they knew or understood what was going on.
Right.
You have described so far outreach activities, so you've talked to many Vermont gas systems customers, but you would agree with me that you don't know for sure that you've talked to the majority of them, is that right?
I am absolutely certain that I have not spoken with the majority of the employees.
So what we're talking about is your perception of what you think the majority would think or do.
Right, I said,
Okay.
if the majority did know. And I'd just like to mention one other reason why I have concerns that they might not. And that is that Vermont Gas is also doing outreach. And I can even tell you on the basis of a letter that was sent to me through several hands responding to a letter sent by Just Power to the Chittenden County Regional Planning Commission, inviting them to attend these technical hearings and essentially say, we think people should come and hear for themselves. We think it's important that policymakers, that elected officials, as well as nominated officials who have constituents in the 3 counties and elsewhere in Vermont should come here and hear the evidence, because it's very difficult to actually get enough information in order to make a reasonable decision for oneself about his or her position. So Vermont Gas followed that up and actually wrote a letter that said that Vermont Gas had no intention of raising rates 15% in order to cover the cost of the pipeline. And that Vermont, as has been said here over and over, is committed to affordable and competitive rates and several other things that I think, while read to black letter, are true. reading between the lines, they did not actually address the issues that the company was saying that they were addressing in each paragraph. And so it actually made the waters quite murky in terms of what the potential impact on ratepayers will be. I have also done quite a bit of research and asking it. We've done a lot of collection of newsletters and other things, and we have not found any information in newsletters that explains to anyone what the impact of the cost increase might be, or explains specifically how the SURF is being used, since it is being used for a specific project versus for infrastructure in general.
Ms. Peyser, could I ask you to turn to page 6 of your May 28 testimony?
Of my May 28.
At lines 15 through 17, you're recounting a statement from Mr. Rendell. Quote, "We are a customer-focused energy services company providing services in a competitive market." At line 19 in that passage, you testify that this statement is in part misleading. I'd like to understand, are you saying that Mr. Rendell is misleading the board in that statement, or are you saying that his statement is incomplete or inaccurate?
I'm saying that it is incomplete, but in omitting the other parts of VGS's mission, which they actually do explain on their website in full, that I think it suggests that Vermont Gas might be willing to make concessions to its profits that the company is unlikely to make.
On page 2 of your May 28 testimony, you're discussing a statement at line 22 or thereabouts from Dr. Hopkins. And on line 22, you say that I'll read the statement first. At line 17, you quote Dr. Hopkins' statement, which is that he concludes that, quote, "delivered CNG also does not meet the market demand in all sectors, open param, e.g. those requiring firm delivery, including residential and small commercial customers," close param. You ask yourself, do you agree with this conclusion? And then on line 21, you say, no, the implication of Dr., you write Mr., but I assume you meant Doctor, of Dr. Hopkins' statement is that delivered CNG cannot meet market demand in all sectors. You then say, I believe that this is misleading. Do you see that? Again, do you mean to testify that Dr. Hopkins is misleading the board, or do you mean to testify that he has made an incorrect or inaccurate statement?
I mean to say that I believe that the sentence as read is misleading.
My question was, do you believe he's misleading the board?
I don't believe he was misleading the board. I said that the sentence is misleading.
Thank you. You testify, demand for natural gas in Addison could be met by delivered CNG or delivered absorbed natural gas in canisters, open paren, collectively referred to as, quote, delivered CNG or open quote truck CNG, close paren. But for restrictions placed on companies capable of meeting this demand by memoranda of understanding signed between those companies, DPS and VGS. Could I ask you first to clarify, you write, but for restrictions placed on companies, which companies do you mean?
I mean NG Advantage.
Any other company?
And a NerdTech or a Nerd.
Such as the power of your testimony is Peyser.
Or as Mr. Young said, the volume rate of it, or the number of words.
Okay, that's okay, I'll just go with
Okay. I've noticed that you've attached to your testimony of May 28 an exhibit that is NP-2R-Peyser-12, which is the Memorandum of Understanding among NG Advantage LLC, the Vermont Department of Public Service and Vermont Gas Systems, Inc. Could I ask you to turn to that document? Having that document in mind and the testimony that I just read, do you have any evidence that these companies, NG Advantage and EnergyTech, well, first off, I think only NG Advantage, do you have any evidence that NG Advantage did not voluntarily enter into this MOU? This MOU?
No, I believe they did because of market entry reasons. I believe that they had a disproportionate amount of power in the market and they faced.
Peyser, my question was, do you have any evidence that NG Advantage did not voluntarily enter into this MOU?
I don't think I can answer that question as phrased and be accurate.
Okay, how would you answer the question then?
I would say that I believe that they did it voluntarily in the legal sense of were they competent to make the decision that they were going to do it. I think they did it because they feared that they would have a much more difficult time in a regulatory sense if they did not agree to do it, that both parties, DPS and VGS, would have opposed their request for a declaratory judgment for the board not to exercise its jurisdiction over them. And so I believe that in order to resolve that problem, they were willing to sign the memorandum of understanding.
Without going into what you might have heard, did you talk to someone at NG Advantage?
I did not. I read all of the transcripts and all of the filings. So I did a public records request to the board to get all of the documents.
The transcripts of what?
The transcript of the pre-hearing conference. There were, as far as I know from the documents that I received from the Public Service Board, there was not a full hearing on the issue because the MOU was signed.
And you have no comparable basis with respect to EnergyTech, is that correct?
I do not. My colleague George Gross actually worked on that part.
But you yourself don't?
I read the EnergyTech MOU and I've read quite a bit about them, but we did not have access to the full record for that.
At page 19 of your May 28 testimony, you testified, I cannot find any evidence in Mr. Rome's pre-filed testimony, his resume, or any of VGS's answers to discovery questions about the PwC team's qualifications to suggest that any member of the team has significant experience in carrying out cost estimation for natural gas transmission pipelines or for natural gas pipeline projects in general.
I'm sorry, could you just tell me the page again? I've been listening to what you're saying, but I don't know where to find it.
Page 19, lines 1 through 3. I'm assuming, Mr. Grake, that your witness does not have petitioner RR1, which is Mr. Rome's resume, up there with her.
I think that's correct.
What I'm going to do is read 2 paragraphs from it, and then if you'd like to look at the document, you'll ask your counsel about that. In paragraph 1 of exhibit petitioner RR-1, it reads, quote, he has worked with industry leaders to develop organizational and delivery structures on capital projects ranging from electric and gas transmission, renewable generation and integration, smart grid technologies, and programmatic system improvements. In paragraph 2 of that same document, quote, Ralph has worked with gas transmission clients on managing increased pipeline construction by helping develop structures that can support the increased pace of expansion while managing risks associated with planning, permitting, and constructing pipeline projects. Assuming that you accept my verbatim quote from the exhibit, in light of that information, is there still a reason why the board should conclude that no member of the PwC team has significant experience in carrying out cost estimation for natural gas transmission pipelines or for natural gas pipeline projects in general?
Could you please go back and read me the first sentence of the first paragraph?
He has worked with industry leaders to develop organizational and delivery structures on capital projects ranging from electric and gas transmission, renewable generation and integration, smart grid technologies, and programmatic system improvements.
I would say that I still the sentence as written that I wrote, that I do not find any evidence that he worked on cost estimation in gas transmission. I continue to not find that evidence in those two paragraphs. One might infer, however, the specific disciplines mentioned do not necessarily include cost estimation. They may include management of a budget. They may include looking at larger policy issues related to the economics of projects, and many other things, but specifically cost estimation, I do not find evidence of that there.
So should I take that to mean that a risk associated with planning, permitting, and constructing pipeline projects in your estimation is not cost estimation? Cost estimation is not one of those risks, is that
I would
right?
say it's one of those questions that all kangaroos are marsupials, but not all marsupials are kangaroos. So unless I know more about the marsupial statement, I don't know whether they're kangaroos or not.
At page 20 of your testimony, lines 9 through 10, you testified that VGS and Velco are affiliated companies. Do you see that in your testimony? What is your basis for that statement?
My basis for that statement is prior board decisions.
They're affiliated? Are you using that in a legal sense or just in a general sense?
I'm using that in the sense of FERC's definition or the SEC's definition of affiliated utilities and restrictions placed on them in terms of their arm's length operations.
If I can ask you
I might just say one more thing, which is that at this very moment, I cannot recollect, although I'd be happy for our counsel to provide it later, that there is actually a statement by Velco or VGS specifically saying that in one of their own documents. So I have a visual recollection of the actual statement, but I don't have a visual recollection of what that document was. But I would be happy to dig it up and provide it.
Thank you. Could I ask you to turn to page 10 of your May 28 testimony? Could I ask you to review lines 7 through 10? It's the sentence that begins the idea that.
Okay.
As I read the sentence, I kept waiting for something more.
Right.
Could you complete the thought?
I can see that.
Yeah.
I think the point that I was trying to make was that with an increase in the cost of construction for the project, it was hard to believe that VGS would not have to raise its rates.
Thank you. Farther down on that same page of your testimony, page 10, at lines 11 through 18, you testify, moreover, any attempt by VGS and DPS to suggest that decisions in other documents could influence the benefits of the project goes against the spirit and letter of Section 248. There would be no need for Section 248 review if a utility and DPS could simply say that the board could control through future dockets the rate impact and thereby the net benefit of the project and or the competitive advantage of the rates as they influence demand, uptake of natural gas, and necessity for the project. Such an approach would undermine the stringent standards that the Vermont legislature set for the board and essentially suggests that the board make policy by circumventing the Section 248 criteria. Do you see that statement?
And I would say that instead of documents on line 12, it should say dockets.
I beg your pardon?
On line 12, the first word should say dockets, not documents.
Okay, so dockets. Ms. Peyser, do you mean to say that a Section 248 review requires the board to conclusively assess the rate impacts of the proposed project based on project cost estimates?
No.
Why should the board not infer that from this statement?
Perhaps it was not written in a clear manner. I was trying to reference actually the criteria further down. My concern being that there has been a suggestion that the board ought to wait until later rate cases, and the board, and I'm trying to remember whether it was DPS or VGS, but I think it was echoed in things written and that have been said by both, which is that the board can have a great deal of influence on the impact of this project by either not approving, actually there are three things, not approving VGS's proposed rates in its next rate case, by altering the approved capital structure for VGS, so essentially allowing VGS to take on more debt than it currently has been approved to do. Or, let me try to remember what the third thing is because I'm getting tired. Or altering its approved rate of return or return on equity. And my concern is that if the idea is that the board will fix the problems of this project, in other words, the board will take steps that would actually change the outcome of your decision-making and your analysis of whether or not the project would actually there would be sufficient demand for the project, for example, given the rates as they would be likely to have to be, what would that do to the competitive advantage of the project given the other alternatives, such if it were to occur that there were not enough demand and you were to determine that today, but the response to that would be, well, that's okay because we'll fix that later by allowing them to take on more debt now, or allowing them, or saying to ourselves, we're just not going to let them, we're not going to approve that rate, or we're not going to approve their rate on return later, or we're going to ask them to lower their rate of return later. I don't think that that is actually the way that the 248 statute was envisioned from the legislative history, that the idea was actually that a project must meet the criteria today, and it must stand on its own. Not that you, if something doesn't end up working out the way you think it would, that you will change it later in order to make the project comply. Or that we can say, we're not going to worry about those criteria now because we have a lot of influence and we can fix it later. I don't think that that was what the legislature intended when it wrote the 248 statute. I think it intended to say a project must stand on its own today and meet the criteria. Certainly you're doing projections to think out about whether it will meet those criteria going forward. But if the idea is that an intervention by you will solve any problems that might come about that would have, looking backwards, if you had said, well, we wouldn't have done this project no longer meets the criteria, that somewhere in the middle of this process you would say, oh, well, we'll in a separate docket, we're going to say this project is okay today in this docket, because in 9 months, we will change the rate of return. I don't think that that was what was intended by the Section 248 statute.
I have no further questions.
Any follow-up based on our questions?
No.
Any redirect?
No.
Okay, ready for your next witness?
Yes. George Gross, please.
Thank you, Ms. Potter.
Could you state your name, please?
George M. Gross.
Oh, I'm sorry, I apologize.
Okay. Thank you. Hello. Do you swear or affirm under penalty of perjury that the testimony you about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Could you state your name, please?
George M. Gross.
Mr. Gross, my understanding is that you provided pre-filed testimony exhibits, a corrected testimony and corrected exhibit, rebuttal testimony and attachments, and rebuttal corrected exhibits. Did I get that correct?
Yes.
Okay. And one issue that I want to clarify, on your exhibits, they're labeled consecutively with letters, am I right?
Yes. The one exception is in my rebuttal testimony, there were 2 exhibits that didn't have a label attached properly to them. They were blank, and those should probably be assigned a label number, label J and K, respectively.
Okay. And except for that, it's your direct exhibits were properly identified by letter. There weren't 2 exhibit A's.
No, unless you inadvertently looked at the version that was old that we corrected.
Okay, thank you. I believe Mr. Gross's exhibits with corrections have been provided to the parties, the board, as well as the court reporter, and I would move their admission.
Any objection?
None.
Okay, they're admitted.
Mr. Gross is available for questions.
Okay, I believe no one else has questions except for the board, is that right?
Good evening, Mr. Rose.
Hi.
I have a few questions for you. In your pre-filed testimony of May 6th, at page 9, you talk about, at line 12, you talk about the compressed natural gas tanker company's strategic group. What is that group and who belongs to it?
So that refers to a cluster of companies that are relatively similar in the way they develop their product and deliver it to the marketplace. In this case, the two examples in Vermont are NG Advantage and Intertech North Country LLC. There may be others that I'm not aware of.
Do they have a strategic group?
Well, they occupy a niche in the industry services provided to this
So
part.
this clustering is something you have done?
Yes, it was part of my judgment of how to organize who are the players in the marketplace.
So would that be the same thing as with the community solar and heat pump strategic group?
Again, yes, in other words, they have common technology, sometimes they have common trade associations. Their products have a lot of similarity to one another, other than their features might differ in the detail.
And with the beer strategic group? The
Yep.
building energy efficiency retrofit?
Yep.
Okay, so you made these up?
Yeah, part of doing an industry analysis is to basically dissect the industry groups.
On page 15 of your May 6th testimony, at lines 5 to 6, you state that compressed natural gas offers a lower cost per delivered BTU than the incumbents.
Mhm.
And at lines 7 to 8, that CNG delivery of VGS gas product is already proven to be an economically viable substitute for the VGS ANGP gas pipeline. I'm trying to appreciate how you came to these conclusions. Could you walk me through how you developed and used, you referred to exhibit,
Exhibit A?
Exhibit A, gross exhibit A, how you derived that?
Okay, so Exhibit A is a, if I remember, let's see if I can look at it, make sure I'm talking about the right one. Exhibit A is a business modeling that basically tried to sketch out what it looks like to deliver compressed natural gas into the Addison County market, specifically the Middlebury Gas Island. What are the costs of delivering that product? What's the likely price that they would see given certain assumptions? And then comparing that to what we know as the price of the gas product from Vermont Gas, and assuming that the pipeline incurred a rate increase.
So, you know, I'm just, again, where did you get the data to support the statement that compressed natural gas offers a lower cost per delivered MMBTU than incumbents?
Okay, well, in Exhibit A, I developed basically a dissection of what different suppliers offer, how they go about doing that, what is their likely costs, what's their likely profit margin, and at the end of this, you end up with an estimate of the cost or price per million BTUs delivered to the doorstep at the gas island. At basically the distance from, in this case, the NG Advantage station up in northern Vermont, delivered to the Middlebury Agrimark unloading facility.
I'm trying to remember today, I think we heard testimony that there's like a $6 price difference in MMBTU between compressed natural gas and pipeline gas, with the compressed natural gas being the higher number. How does that comport with your conclusion here?
So certainly Exhibit A has a different set of assumptions than today's current scenario.
Well, okay, so this doesn't reflect a reality, this reflects a projection.
Yes, it does. It assumes, I think I've made that very explicit. In Exhibit A, you'll see there's an assumptions worksheet, and there's a parameter you plug in for the rate increase
I'm sorry,
over
and
today's
there's-
prices.
Couldn't hear you.
The-
And there's a,
In the Exhibit A spreadsheet, there's a assumptions worksheet. In there, there is modeling parameters, of one of which is the rate increase applied for, in this case, whatever Vermont gas rate class you're talking about.
Well, that's my problem, because basically, most of my questions have to do with attempting to understand and appreciate the fact that this is a projection based on assumptions, rather than a reflection or a projection based on data that is current. In your pre-file your direct pre-file testimony of May 6th and your pre-file testimony of May 28th differ, I believe, in as much as the latter refers to the delivery of CNG to residences and business parks, sharing a distribution network as being economically viable, where I believe in your earlier testimony you said that you didn't think that could happen.
So that reflects, as in any competitive analysis situation, you're always gathering new information, new intelligence about what's available. Intertech was a new entrant that I wasn't as fully aware of and couldn't integrate into my earlier filing. Once I had enough information about Intertech to actually place the filing together like I did on the 28th, I assembled as much as I could based on what I could do in the limited amount of time I had to do it. Specifically, Intertech had signaled through a press interview they did in the Swanton Reporter back in May of last year that their intention to serve the residential small business market, and a view of their website described this patented absorbed natural gas technology that they use to deliver canisters to the customer's doorstep. And the interview with the reporter indicated a 10 to 15% price advantage relative to the other options out there in the market.
Do you know if any infrastructure has been developed by Intertech or any other companies to make that happen?
The last press release I saw from them earlier this year showed that they had acquired property in Swanton to develop the terminal. I don't know the status of their Act 250 proceeding or anything else.
There is some discussion in your testimony as well that Intertech is prohibited from selling small-scale CNG delivery services.
So let me
sorry, I didn't hear you. Selling small-scale CNG deliveries?
Right.
And
Delivery
we really
services.
can't hear you back here, because you keep leaning that way, and the mic's
Sure.
over there. Sorry, we just really want to pay attention.
Sure, I understand, I'm sorry.
Thank you.
Try to fix that.
Okay, let me try again.
Still got it. You got it.
It is on.
Okay.
Push it closer.
Okay.
Yay.
Got it.
Thank you.
Is there language in the Intertech MOU that prohibits Intertech from selling small-scale CNG delivered services without access to piped natural gas?
So I think I spoke to this directly in my rebuttal testimony. There was a section that actually addressed this. Paraphrasing without going back to the exact language, it is true that they could go back to the Public Service Board for a change in the current conditions that are imposed on them by the MOU, but it is a de facto barrier to entry because there's no certainty that they will go through the regulatory process with terms that they can actually make a business work for them.
But it's one that they entered into voluntarily.
Well, this gets to the question of what has happened in the MOU negotiations that we don't know. The whole process is closed. There's no way for me, for example, to do a public records request that I'm aware of to discover any transcripts.
So your assumption is because of that there was some collusion and force, as opposed to the operation of the free market?
Well, there clearly is there's no evidence available. Obviously, you can't look inside the dark bottle and see what's inside it. We don't know what happened. So that's only one possible explanation. Another explanation is, yes, they did, in fact, do that. But the fact that they had announced in their press release that they were going to serve the residential market and they came away with an MOU that did not suggests to me that that was a very significant change in their business plan. And effectively, they had a barrier to entry. They could not, that's a major change in your business plan.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Jay.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gross. Nice to see you again. Mr. Gross and I have interacted in the net metering world. In your May 6th testimony on page 3, you state that the company's assessment of GHG impacts for the Phase 2 project, which was the subject of Doc 8010, were biased. I wanted to clarify whether you thought the analysis presented by the company in this docket was subject to similar issues.
Yes, it is.
And also, could you please elaborate on your statement that biomethane cannot be scaled up to meet Vermont Gas's demand without adverse land use impacts?
Okay, both of these questions are addressed more fully in my findings in the other docket, 8180, and obviously in the public record. So in the short, in both of these filings, I looked at different aspects of the Phase 2 pipeline and the greenhouse gas. It was a major focus of my filings, and in fact, I learned a lot and did a significant amount of research about what are the greenhouse gas metrics that are used by scientists and also by politicians and policymakers. What I discovered is that the greenhouse gas, the so-called global warming potential, GWP, that's commonly used by Vermont and many other jurisdictions, has unfortunately some significant defects that make it subjective, and when placed in front of an administrative judiciary like this board, could in fact allow different parties to contend that they had the right estimate or statement of what the value of the greenhouse gas emissions was, or the reduction in emissions. This is a very complicated topic, but I will try and in a short address it. But the essence is that what's not commonly understood is that this the global warming potential actually is one of two metrics. The absolute global warming potential is an actual measurement of the radiative forcing of the particular gas, whether it be methane or carbon dioxide or any of the others, nitrous oxides, that are greenhouse gas. And every gas has its own, if you will, characteristic signature as far as how long it lasts in the atmosphere and how it decays. What global warming potential is a ratio between that absolute value and carbon dioxide's absolute global warming potential. And unfortunately, without getting into the weeds, it's very hard to describe to this community, this group. What happens is basically if you look at methane on a short time scale, as you know, 20 years, the potential for global warming is upwards of 86 times more potent than carbon dioxide. In contrast, if you average it over 100 years, that same unit or pulse of methane that you release is only basically the methane decays, and its contribution to global warming decays over time to the point where it's no longer in the atmosphere around year 50. And at 100 years, the overall effect is only a warming potential of 34 times more than 1 unit of carbon dioxide. And so depending on which time frame you look at, you can skew the results and the impact of those methane emissions. And in this case, with natural gas, methane being the dominant source of greenhouse gas and warming potential. In this example, the docket A180, I compared it to heavy fuel oil and discovered that, in fact, by doing a substitution of natural gas for heavy fuel oil, there was essentially no benefit between the two for the first 50 years, which was the life of the project.
So is it your criticism that if there are greenhouse gas benefits, that they just don't accrue to Vermont and the rest of the planet fast enough?
Well, I would characterize it as there are several things I recommended. There would be possible ways for the board to address this issue, which some of which would be a change in the way the state perceives or measures, or uses metrics. In other words, the IPC Assessment Report 5 that was published this past year in 2014, I guess it was 2014, has refined the science around metrics, and this has got very important implications for energy policy and how we measure methane emissions in particular. They specifically say that there is no merit to using a 100-year lifespan as a measure for methane emissions. They specifically say it's dependent on the regulatory context or how you're applying the metric. So that leads me to conclude that in this case, when we look at this project and our legislative goal of moving to 90% renewables by 2050, there's a major disconnect. That we're investing in an infrastructure that we're already talking about having a service life of upwards of at least 50 years, maybe even 70. And yet, in fact, at this short timer, by 35 years from now, we would want to get at least 90% of the methane replaced with some renewable substitute. Now, to your question about renewable natural gas, my other filing in this realm looked at what would be the potential impacts of using, for example, dairy, landfill, gas emissions, composting, all these different possible ways of gathering methane and assembling them to create a biomethane replacement. And my first take with back of the envelope assessment was that this would require a significant of land use impacts on Vermont to either have a lot of cows or a lot of other approaches to doing this generation of biomethane, like using forest and cutting it into chips and then going through a thermal process to convert it into methane. These are all possible technologies that exist today, but they all have land use impacts, and there's been no attempt to quantify them and develop a land use policy that could support it and make it sustainable.
Just one follow-up. A lot of those activities that you just described sounded agricultural in nature, or at least arguably so. This state has at times advocated policies that favor agriculture. Do you think that those land use impacts still need to be looked at, even if they are agricultural in nature?
Yes, in fact, actually, some legislation recently done by legislature kind of split the regulatory jurisdiction of a farm between the part that the Department of Agriculture does and the board has jurisdiction. That has unfortunate consequences as a side effect, which is that no one's looking at the farm in a global sense, and so one half could be saying it's fine, and another side might say not.
Thank you.
Good afternoon, Mr. Gross. I want to talk about your CNG gas island proposal for a little bit.
Okay.
And I understand in your testimony you state that it's proven to be an economically viable substitute for the pipeline. Is that correct?
Well, qualified with the assumptions that we spoke about earlier in the Exhibit A.
If one accepts some of the assumptions you've used.
Well, there are several key assumptions I'd like to bring to the board that are embedded in this and may not be immediately obvious. So to help turn the discussion in that direction, I'd like to turn our focus on gas island picture, the diagram that's in your illustration 1.
Well, actually, let me just stop you because I want to get into the diagram more than I want the rate issue, and we'll circle back to the rate issue. Because,
okay.
Because right now, I'd actually like to understand the diagram, and at least in my testimony, in my version, I'm looking at the May 8th version, and it's on page 19. Is that what you're looking at?
Yes.
Okay. I'm trying to understand exactly how the different pieces work. So your basic idea is you're going to have this gas island, and that's in the cloud on the right-hand side of the diagram?
Yes.
And there's a distribution network, and who owns that and who installs it?
And the assumptions I was making is Vermont Gas that owns and operates it because they are, by statute, the only entity allowed to do pipe distribution for gas.
Do you know whether it would be possible to authorize somebody else to do that type of distribution?
I think there's a legal opinion I'd need to So some of those, there are statutes that are in this area, and I've read them once, but I can't speak to their application here.
That's fine. And would this gas island distribution network go to only industrial and large commercial customers? Would it go to retail residential customers? I mean, you're talking about a distribution network. Where's it going?
So as far as I can tell, there's no physical or technical reason they could not serve firm customers. The question has been raised on multiple occasions to suggest that CNG cannot do firm. To that, I would say that's a service availability issue, which I happen to get familiar with, again, through the docket 8180, which was a study to see what would service availability change if there was storage on site. And it turns out that statistically, if you look at what are the peak heating hours and days served by Vermont Gas's network, it's a very narrow slice out of all the week. And so it's possible, even sometimes desirable from a service availability perspective, to store gas. In this case, you would store it at the head end of the gas island so that you could bridge those spikes and carry the load for those days that really it zooms up.
And if one does that, somebody has to install facilities to store it there and also incur the cost of storing it because the gas is not being used.
True. Okay. That's part of that, although I did not model that.
Okay.
I would also point out the alternative is the model that was advocated by Intertech, where they deliver small canisters onto site. And in that case, it's like an unregulated fuel dealer who looks at their customers' usage profile and proactively places storage on site in anticipation of peak loads.
Right. I'm actually trying to just focus on your proposal because it's the one that you suggest is more cost effective. It can be more cost effective, or is not. Is the reason the pipeline may not be least cost, and so I'd like to just understand what you're proposing.
Of course.
Who pays for that distribution network? Is it rolled into Vermont Gas's overall rates, or is it just the customers on that gas island distribution network?
Well, that's clearly getting into the business model issues. Earlier we talked about this in this legal opinion about whether, in fact, any entity besides Vermont Gas is authorized. Do they have an exclusive franchise in the state of Vermont? I don't know.
Well, just put aside that issue. What would you propose, assuming there were no restrictions?
Okay, in that case, then it basically could be open for bid. It would be something not unlike any other public facility that's operated by a privatized company. It would be available to the lowest cost provider who meets the criteria that you specify for safety and affordability.
So you're suggesting that the board would basically say, hey, we want a gas island distribution and open it up to bid for any company who wants to,
I think,
is that the idea?
In the long term, yeah, I think I speak to this in the testimony. There's obviously two models that are in parallel here. One is the obvious one where you simply put out for bid the delivery from the CNG terminal down to the head end of the gas island. And the business is basically just the delivery charge, moving the gas down to the head end. Where you could see it going and where there could be a lot of room for innovation is where you accept bids from other parties for not only the delivery of the gas to the head end, but also to the people who want to choose the gas product. If, for example, biomethane was available, but at a premium price, some people may decide they like that option over a frac gas solution. So you would unbundle the supply of gas from the distribution and buy that independent of it. Now, if you want to unbundle the distribution and also pick a provider for distribution service, that's also possible.
Well, when you had in mind that this suggested that the pipeline was not least cost, you, I presume, had one model that you examined, and for purposes of that, what I'm trying to understand is, I mean, you just laid out that you could do it this way, that way, or whatever. Which is the one that you costed out to reach the conclusion that the pipeline was not least cost?
So that's the model in spreadsheet A, which in this case is assumed that the board allows CNG vendors to waive a waiver on the cost of purchasing gas. The current model, what's going on today, and perhaps one of the reasons why CNG today costs $6 more per MMBtu than the alternative by pipeline is that there's actually a double dip here. The CNG vendor, in this case CNG Advantage, buys the gas from Vermont Gas. delivers it to the Middlebury Gas Island, and then Vermont Gas turns around, buys the gas back, and delivers it down through their distribution network. That overhead clearly is part of their current price. In the case where a vendor is delivering that gas to the head end of a gas island, that charge could be waived by the board, and the only charge for distribution would be occurring on the gas island. So that so-called CMG tariff, which is in this diagram here, if that was not included in the price of cost delivered to the customers, would reduce the price at least $1 or $2 per MCF, somewhere in that range.
Well, I'm trying to do this in small pieces just so I understand, and each time I ask the small piece, you answer.
Fair enough.
Because I'm missing. Who is selling the gas? Let's assume this is Middlebury. Vermont Gas builds a distribution system there. Who is selling? And well, actually, let me back up. Who is building the CNG unloading facility, and who's paying for that?
Well, it's already been bought. So, if you're to build other ones, here you're getting into the question of how do you actually create a gas island company.
When you say it was already bought, you mean the one that's already there?
Yeah, it's already been bought.
Okay, so the one that's there, and who owns it right now?
That's not immediately obvious to me. I think it's a shared asset between Agrimark, Cabot, and Vermont Gas, but I don't know the particulars of their deal. But I do know that there's a CNG adder that has a surcharge to customers that requires them to repay the facility cost, the development cost, back to Agrimark.
Who is selling the gas? Let's say Agrimark is the customer who is hooked up to this this distribution, gas island distribution network. Who is selling them the gas under the proposal that you have put forward?
My version had two models. One was the obvious one where Vermont Gas is doing that, and then the alternative I just spoke of, which was you unbundle the gas supplier from distribution, and you have a different cost because of that.
Have you attempted to cost out at all the cost of building the distribution network that you're envisioning, and how that would how that affects the overall cost effectiveness of this?
Well, the distribution network is already kind of in the cards as far as Middlebury's expectations, right? There are customers who expect to get gas service, and they may not care whether it's CNG or pipeline, as long as it saves them money, if they think it's going to save them money. Now, that's a separate topic, of course, which is what is the overhead of the CNG trucking versus a pipeline. And that was why I spent a lot of time trying to evaluate what we call the CNG adder, which is the overhead per MCF of delivering to a gas island.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Any follow-up to our questioning? Any redirect?
Yeah.
Okay. We're ready for the next witness.
Mr. Palmer, please.
Off the record though, actually, so can we keep going? I don't know if the court reporter can. We can schedule another day.
It's not fair to ask me in front of everyone. Yes, I can keep going. You want to take a short break? No, thank you. Let's just go.
All right.
Hello, Mr. Palmer. Hello. Just like to remind you that you remain under oath from your appearance in this docket previously.
Yes, I am. Could you state your name, please?
Nathan Palmer.
And Mr. Palmer, you've done pre-filed testimony and exhibits and rebuttal testimony without exhibits, correct?
I believe that's the way it worked.
And your exhibits are exhibit 1 through 7, yes?
Yes.
And a copy of those exhibits have been provided to the parties, the board, and the court reporter. And I would move their introduction.
Any objection? No objection. Okay. They're admitted.
the witnesses available for questioning?
Okay, it's my understanding the parties have no questions for this witness, is that correct? Anyway, I think we have some questions.
Good evening, Mr. Palmer.
Good evening.
I have a handful of questions for you. At page 5 of your pre-filed rebuttal testimony of May 28th.
My pre-filed rebuttal.
May 28th testimony.
See it, or can you just ask me a
Let me
question?
just
I
ask
see
you
if
a
you
question.
needed to.
Yeah, wing it.
Well, no, I mean,
My
you need to
rebuttal,
refer to it, we
my
can get it.
rebuttal, May 28th, I just found.
Okay, good.
Okay, great. Page 5,
Page 5. Mm-hmm.
line 20.
Yep.
You state if VGS had told the truth. Do you have any evidence that VGS knowingly engaged in a falsehood? That is, that they lied on purpose?
That would be hard for me to tell for sure. You know, it just seems pretty funny the way everything has been playing out here.
Great, thank you. Different subject. Your testimony discusses the risks associated with pipelines in cold climates.
Mm-hmm.
On page 9, you present a table, and I think this is in the original testimony. I talked about it with Mr. St. Hilaire when he was here.
Mm-hmm.
The off-the-charts chart.
Yeah.
Do you know how many incidents occurred in Vermont to yield that result?
I believe it was 3.
3.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Mr. St. Hilaire said there were only 2. Do you have information suggesting that there were 3?
I believe there was a report in the pipeline. I would have to spend some time to find it here, but 2 or 3. You know, it's based on the amount of mileage that's in the state.
Okay. In the article that you drew the chart from, on the last page, the article talks about several areas of vulnerability that pipelines have to frost heat. It cites as mitigation the replacement of cast iron pipe and threaded steel pipe with plastic or welded steel pipe. As I understand it, this is how VGS plans to construct the project. Does this address your concern?
My concern is the depth of the pipe. We seem to be having a lot more occurrences of frost going deeper. This year we've had instances of frost being down 7 feet, and it's always been a concern of mine when they were talking about putting the pipe 2 to 3 feet down, 4 feet under agricultural land, that this is not going to be deep enough to keep us from having frost problems.
And the article itself doesn't address that depth.
It doesn't tell you what the proper depth is. It tells you you should be below the frost line.
Different question. Attached to your testimony are several cost estimates from VGS. Some of them do not have dates attached to them. Do you know what the dates are?
If they're not on there, I wouldn't be able to pull it up from recollection.
Okay, thank you.
Any follow-up to our questions?
Yes, briefly.
No follow-up, then we'll do redirect.
sorry.
Yeah, any follow-up? Okay, then redirect.
Mr. Palmer?
Yeah.
Just tell us what investigation, if any, was done by VGS this past winter of the frost line that you've just described?
None that I'm aware of.
Nothing further.
Thank you. You're excused. I think we've covered all the witnesses at this point. Is that right? And I think the schedule right now calls for briefs due July 6th. So just reminding everyone of that. And I want to thank everybody, especially the court reporter, for allowing us to get done today.
Round of applause.
Have a good evening.
Hey, George. Excuse me. How about if we have a little group prayer as a thank you and a hope that things go well? Does that work for you guys?
There's a lot of serious positive energy here today. Everybody here is coming from different niches of life, and everybody brings entirely different skill sets and passions to the table, but we all hold justice at our core, and that has come to embody what this movement and all social justice, environmental justice movements are about. It's something that transcends just a single action, a single day. It's something we try and bring and incorporate into our daily lives, our daily interactions, and to create real change, we need to take it and share it with those who are neutral at this point and create more active participants.